A woman arrived in a blizzard with nothing. No husband waiting, no home to go to, nothing but two younger siblings and a ledger that could get all three of them killed. Gideon Hale had buried his heart alongside his wife 3 years ago and sworn he would never open his door to anyone again. But that night, when the knocking came through the storm, everything changed forever. This story will make you hold your breath, break your heart, and finally, let you breathe again. Hit like right now. Drop the name of the city where you're watching so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because the best parts are still ahead. The grave sat on a low hill behind the ranch house, sheltered by a pair of cottonwood trees that had been old when Gideon Hale first broke ground on this land. 2 wooden markers, side by side. He had carved them himself with hands that were usually steadier than they'd been that week, and the letters were rougher than he would have liked. Elena Hale, beloved wife. And beneath it, smaller, the one that cost him more than he could put into words, baby girl Hale. Gone before she arrived. He visited every Sunday without exception. 3 years of Sundays, through mud and ice and summer heat that cracked the earth in long pale lines. He brought no flowers anymore. He'd done that early on, brought wildflowers from the creek bank, but they felt wrong after a while, like something he was doing for himself rather than for them. Now he just came and stood there for a while. Sometimes he talked. Usually he didn't. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the carved names until the letters blurred a little, and then he put his hat back on and walked back down the hill to the ranch. His foreman, Silas Boone, had stopped asking him how he was doing around the end of the first year. Not because he didn't care, but because Gideon had the same answer every time. Fine. Said it the way a man said it when he meant the opposite, and knew the other person knew it, and everyone had just agreed to stop pressing. Silas was 61 years old, had worked cattle for 4 decades across 3 territories, and he knew grief when he saw it. He'd lost his own wife to fever 15 years back. So he stopped asking. He just stayed. Showed up every morning before first light, kept the hands in line, managed the books when Gideon couldn't concentrate, and made sure the ranch kept functioning even when the man who owned it had checked out somewhere nobody could follow. Rancho Blue Mesa covered 1,100 acres of Colorado high country. Good grass, reliable water from Colbert Creek, pasture that could carry 500 head without straining. Gideon had bought the eastern quarter from a homesteader who'd given up on the altitude, then added the ridge parcels over a decade of careful, unflashy work. He wasn't the richest man in the territory. Cassian Voss held that distinction, if distinction was the right word for it. But Blue Mesa was solid, debt-free, and built square by a man who understood the difference between owning land and belonging to it. He had belonged to it once. Before. Now he moved through the days like a man finishing a job he'd started and couldn't see a reason to stop. Up before dawn, in the saddle by 6, cattle checked and pastures ridden and fences mended until there was no more light to work by. He ate alone. He slept badly. He had fired 2 ranch hands in the past year for drinking on the job, then felt guilty about it for weeks, which was unlike him. He turned down 2 dinner invitations from neighboring families and one from the pastor in town, which Silas told him was going to get him talked about. Gideon said he'd live with it. The winter that May Carter arrived was the worst the region had seen in a decade. It came early and mean, the first blizzard dropping out of the mountains in late October when half the territory was still hoping for another week of autumn. Gideon had pushed his cattle down from the summer range in September, an early move that cost him in summer grazing but saved him that winter when ranchers who'd waited lost animals by the dozen. He was prepared, the way he was always prepared, because work was the one thing he still did with full attention. He was in the barn on the night she knocked. It was past 9 in the evening, the temperature outside somewhere below 0 with a wind driving snow sideways off the ridge. He was checking on one of the mares who'd been favoring her left foreleg. Probably nothing, a stone bruise, but he wanted to be sure before morning, when he heard the sound. It took him a moment to identify it because the wind was so loud, rattling the barn boards and moaning under the eaves in a way that sounded almost human. Then he heard it again, knocking. Faint, but deliberate. He went to the barn door and opened it, and the cold hit him like a wall. The snow was coming in nearly horizontal, and he had to turn his face sideways to see it all. There was a woman standing in the gap between the barn and the house, holding what appeared to be a boy by one hand and carrying a small girl on her hip. The three of them were wrapped in a single wool blanket that was gray with cold and soaking through, and the woman's hat had been lost somewhere or blown off because her hair was plastered across her face in dark ropes. She said something. He couldn't hear it over the wind. He stepped out and grabbed her arm. Not roughly, just to pull them all inside and get the door shut. And she flinched hard before she could stop herself, which told him something he didn't particularly like to think about. He got them into the barn, got the door latched. The mare looked at the newcomers with mild alarm and went back to her hay. The woman was shaking, not trembling, shaking, the full body kind that happens when muscles have been fighting cold for too long and are starting to lose. The boy was maybe 11, 12, dark-haired and thin-faced, with the stubborn look of a child who'd decided some time ago that he wasn't going to cry about whatever was happening to him. The little girl was pressed into the woman's shoulder with her face hidden, and she was making a low, barely audible sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. "Inside," Gideon said. "Come on." The woman shook her head. The movement was stiff, effortful. "Just the barn," she said. Her voice was rough from cold. "Just till the storm passes. I'm not asking for anything else. You'll freeze in the barn. We'll manage." She said it with the particular flatness of someone who had said things like this before and meant them, and was prepared to mean them again. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the boy, who met his eyes straight on with an expression that was too old for his face. He looked at the little girl, whose small hands were curled in the woman's coat with a grip that must have ached. "No," he said, "you won't." And he turned and started for the house. After a moment, he heard them following. Her name was May Carter. She told him this at the kitchen table, while Silas, who'd appeared from the bunkhouse the moment he'd seen lights moving between the barn and the house, because that was the kind of man Silas was, put a pot of water on the stove and found the jar of dried chamomile that had been in the pantry since Elena put it there. Gideon didn't touch it himself, but he hadn't moved it either. The boy's name was Finn, 12 years old. He sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cup of warm water and drank it in slow, controlled sips like he was rationing something, which he probably had been for longer than Gideon wanted to think about. The little girl was Rose. She was 4, and she had finally detached herself from May's shoulder long enough to accept a piece of hard biscuit from Silas, which she was now eating with the focused intensity of a child who was very hungry. May herself was 26. Gideon hadn't asked her age. She told him because she seemed to understand that information would be required and had decided to offer it before being asked, which was a particular kind of dignity that he recognized. She had traveled from Ohio. She had been engaged, through correspondence, a formal arrangement, to a rancher named Thomas Aldrich, who had a property in the valley 2 days' ride east. She had not met Aldrich before accepting. She had taken the arrangement because her father was dead, and her mother had been dead for years, and there was no money and 2 younger siblings who needed a roof. She had arrived at Aldrich's ranch 4 days ago to find a neighbor woman on the doorstep who told her that Aldrich had died of a lung infection 6 weeks earlier. His property had already been claimed by a cousin who'd ridden up from Texas. The cousin wasn't there, was never there, it turned out. He'd filed the claim and left. But his people were, and they'd made it clear that the house and land weren't available to a woman who'd never actually married the man she'd come to marry. "They gave us 2 days," May said. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was recounting facts with the clean, careful precision of someone who has run out of room for feeling things and is now just managing. "Said they'd call the marshal if we weren't gone." "So you left," Gideon said. "We left." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. The shaking had slowed but not stopped. "I'd heard there was a settlement 2 days west. Figured we could get there before the worst of the storm. I was wrong about the storm." Silas set a bowl of heated beans on the table without comment. Rose immediately redirected her attention from the biscuit. Finn looked at the bowl and then looked at May, who nodded. And then he spooned some into Rose's cup first, and then took some for himself. And May took what was left, and none of them appeared to notice there was anything unusual about the order of operations. Gideon watched this happen. He didn't say anything. "We'll stay the night," May said. "Just the night. If the storm breaks by morning, we'll—" "It won't," he said. She looked at him. The lamp on the table threw shadows across her face, and he could see, now that the cold flush was fading, that she was exhausted in a way that went past physical. The kind of exhausted that lives behind the eyes. The storm won't break before Wednesday, he said. Probably Thursday. This time of year, from the north, they sit. He said it as plainly as he could, because he thought she was the kind of person who'd rather have the truth stated bluntly than wrapped in something soft. You're welcome to stay until it passes. She studied him. We don't have money to pay for lodging. I didn't ask for payment. I'm not looking for charity. I know, he said, which was true. He could see it in every angle of her. They looked at each other across the table. Finn was watching them both with those two old eyes. Rose had finished the beans and had leaned sideways against May's arm and was fighting sleep with the visible effort of a 4-year-old who doesn't want to miss anything. Thank you, May said finally. The words were quiet, and they cost her something. Gideon got up from the table. Silas will show you the rooms upstairs. He took his coat off the hook by the door. I need to finish checking on the mare. He went back out into the cold. He stayed in the barn longer than necessary. When he came back inside, the house was quiet. The rooms he'd put them in were the two that Elena had furnished for guests in the years before. They'd had people to stay, a cousin of hers from Denver once, a neighboring family when their house needed roof repairs, the occasional traveling merchant who'd been caught by weather. Elena had liked having people in the house. She'd been good at it in a way he wasn't, easy and warm with strangers in a way that made them feel like they'd known her for years. After she died, he'd shut those rooms and not thought much about them. He was standing in the upstairs hallway, not for any particular reason, just moving from one end of the house to the other, when he heard it. It came from behind the door at the end of the hall. A child's voice. Finn's voice. Low and absent, the way a person hums when they're not aware they're doing it. Something half-conscious. A scrap of music that belongs to the body before it belongs to the mind. Just a few bars. Simple as a folk song. Gideon stopped walking. He knew that melody. He knew it the way you know certain things that are carved into you before you can think about them. His grandmother's kitchen smell, the sound of rain on the original ranch house roof, the particular way Elena had laughed when something genuinely surprised her. He knew it because Elena had hummed it. She'd hummed it constantly, doing dishes, mending clothes, walking the property in the evenings. It was something her own mother had sung to her. She hadn't known the words, or if she had, she'd never told him. Just the tune, over and over, woven through 3 years of their life together. He stood in the hallway and listened. Finn stopped after a few bars. The house went quiet again. Gideon stood there for a moment longer, then went downstairs and sat in the kitchen in the dark. He didn't sleep much that night. By morning, the blizzard had deepened. The thermometer Silas kept nailed to the bunkhouse door read 15 below. The snow had come up over the lower fence rails, and the horses were restless in the barn, unhappy with the cold and the confinement. 2 of the hands had gotten snowed into the bunkhouse and were making the best of it with cards and bad coffee. The third, a quiet man named Hargrove, had been in town when the storm hit, and Gideon assumed he'd had the sense to stay there. May appeared in the kitchen at 5:30, which surprised him. He'd expected her to sleep, given the condition she'd been in the night before. Instead, she was dressed, dark circles under her eyes making it clear she hadn't slept well, and she was standing at his stove figuring out the damper. I can do that, he said. I've got it. She did. She had it adjusted correctly inside 2 minutes. A wood stove was a wood stove, apparently, and had filled the kettle and set it before he'd managed to put on his boots. They didn't talk much that morning. It wasn't an unfriendly silence. It was more the silence of 2 people who are both accustomed to managing things alone and haven't yet figured out how they're going to manage being in the same space. Finn came down around 6 and wordlessly started sweeping the kitchen floor, which nobody had asked him to do. Rose slept until 7 and came downstairs with her hair standing in 4 directions and a serious expression that suggested she had opinions about this situation. Silas joined them for breakfast and was immediately and completely won over by Rose, who told him his hat was funny in a tone that made it clear she meant it as a compliment. He laughed so hard his face went red, which Gideon had not seen in some time. After breakfast, May helped him check the cattle. He hadn't asked her to. He'd just mentioned he needed to do it, and she'd put on her coat and followed, which he found both presumptuous and practical in equal measure. The snow was deep enough that moving through it required effort, and the wind had dropped, but not stopped. They went through the herd together, Gideon counting heads and checking the hay situation in the winter pasture. May moving alongside him with her eyes open and her mouth mostly shut. "You know cattle," he said, when she correctly identified a heifer that was standing apart from the others and probably needed watching. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Not this scale. Hogs mostly. Some beef." He nodded. He kept moving through the herd. "Your foreman," she said. "Silas. He's been with you a long time?" 12 years. "He's good with the girl." "He's good with most people," Gideon said. "Better than I am." She didn't argue with that, which he appreciated. They were on their way back to the house when she stopped walking. He was 3 steps ahead before he noticed and turned around. She was standing in the snow with her hands in her coat pockets, and she was looking at the house, at the way the smoke came from the chimney, and the yellow lamplight showed in the kitchen window and the low hill behind it, where the cottonwood trees stood gray and bare against the white sky. "The grave's on the hill," she said. "I saw them this morning." He waited. "Family?" she asked. "My wife," he said, "and our daughter." He said it the same way he always did, flat and exact. "She died in childbirth, 3 years ago." May was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the field between them and the house. "I'm sorry," she said. Not in the way people said it when they didn't know what else to say, in the way that meant she had some specific understanding of what the words were covering. "Her name was Elena," he said. He didn't know why he said it. He almost never told people that, strangers. They usually knew, or they didn't ask. May looked at the hill for a moment longer. Then she said, "We should get back inside. Rose will have Silas talking to his hat by now." He almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but he almost did. The storm held for 4 days, and in those 4 days the ranch, which had been a quiet and solitary thing for 3 years, became something else. It didn't happen in any grand way. There was no moment of revelation, no transformation he could point to later and say, "There, that's when everything changed." It was just the accumulation of small things, the way a creek bed fills, quietly, without announcement, until one morning you look and it's full. Finn, it turned out, was handy. Gideon discovered this when the boy appeared in the barn on the second morning and asked, in a matter-of-fact way, if there was anything that needed doing. Gideon put him to work mucking stalls, expecting him to last 20 minutes. He lasted until noon without complaint and did the job correctly the first time. That afternoon he asked Silas to show him how the pulley on the hayloft worked and spent 2 hours figuring it out. And when he finally got it, he didn't whoop or celebrate, just nodded to himself and tried it again to make sure it wasn't a fluke. Rose, meanwhile, had installed herself in the kitchen with a sovereignty that suggested she'd been there longer than any of them. She had found, in the cabinet below the sink, a collection of spoons and a tin pot that she used for purposes known only to herself. She arranged them, rearranged them, narrated to them. She asked Gideon questions every time he came through the kitchen. Where was the creek? Were there fish in the creek? Did fish get cold in winter? Did they wear coats? Where did they go? He answered all of them, which surprised him. He wasn't particularly practiced at answering questions from 4-year-olds, but she asked them with such genuine scientific interest that it felt wrong not to try. "Fish don't wear coats," he told her, on the 3rd day. She considered this with enormous seriousness. "What do?" "They go deeper," he said, "to where it's warmer." "Oh." Another long pause. "That's smart?" He'd agreed that it was. May was in the kitchen most mornings, then out with him or Silas checking cattle or clearing snow from the water troughs in the afternoon. She didn't ask for assignments. She looked at what needed doing and did it. She had opinions about the position of the winter hay, about one of the hands who she'd quietly noted was leaving the gate between the north and south pastures unlatched, and she stated them plainly and without ceremony. And twice she was right in ways that cost him some small measure of pride to acknowledge. She wasn't easy to be around exactly. She was private in ways that made him aware she was keeping things close. She'd go quiet sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, and he'd watch her wrestling with something internal, and then she'd come back and say something that was never quite what she'd been thinking. She did the dishes every evening without asking whether she should, and one night, when he came in from a late check on the cattle, he found her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, reading a book she'd apparently had in her bag, and she'd looked up at him with an expression that was almost defensive, as if she'd been caught doing something she wasn't sure she was allowed to do. On the fourth night, after Finn and Rose were in bed, she came to find him in the study. He was at the desk Elena had picked out, dark walnut, too big for the room, doing the winter accounting. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and he set down his pencil and waited. "There's something you need to know," she said, "about why I'm here. The real reason." He leaned back in his chair. "All right." She sat down across from him, not in the comfortable chair by the window, but in the hard-backed chair nearest the door, as if she might need to move quickly. She had, he noticed, a leather satchel she'd brought from upstairs. She set it on the desk between them and opened it. "My father wasn't just a farmer," she began. "He was a county record keeper. For 12 years, in Harlan County." She paused, as if calibrating how much to tell him, and in what order. "He kept records. Land records, primarily. Survey documents, title transfers, deed registrations. He was meticulous about it. He believed the documents were the difference between a man having a legal claim and a man having nothing but his word." Gideon watched her hands. They were still. 3 years ago, a man started buying land in Harlan County, quietly, at first. Legal purchases, fair prices, nothing unusual. But my father started noticing patterns. She set a leather-bound ledger on the desk. It was thick, the cover worn, the pages dog-eared in a way that suggested repeated consultation. He started keeping this, copies of documents that had been altered, land titles that should have matched survey records but didn't, deeds that had been filed with dates changed by a few days, just enough to give a buyer priority in a disputed claim. "Who was buying?" Gideon asked, though he was starting to have a thought. "A holding company called Voss and Meridian Land Partners." She met his eyes. "Cassian Voss's operation." He was quiet for a moment. "Voss operates here, in Colorado." "He operates everywhere," she said. Her voice was flat. "He has offices in 4 territories. He buys land under different company names, so the pattern isn't obvious, but the trail is there if you know where to look. My father knew where to look." She tapped the ledger. "He spent 2 years documenting it. Fraud, extortion, bribery of county officials. At least 9 ranches and 3 territories that were taken through manipulated legal processes. Families that lost everything because someone changed a number on a document and the record keeper was either bought or afraid." "Your father wasn't bought," Gideon said. "No." Her jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't. He understood from the way she said it. He didn't make her say the rest. She let out a slow breath. "He sent me a letter 2 months before he died. Told me what he had, told me to come get the ledger if anything happened to him. He died in October. They called it an accident. A fall down the stairs of the records office, alone, in the evening." She looked at her hands. "My father was the most careful man I've ever known. He checked his bootlaces twice before he walked on a wet floor. And the ledger. He'd hidden it. I found it where he said it would be." She straightened. "I was going to take it to federal authorities in Denver before I left. But Voss's people were watching the county office, watching our house. I had Finn and Rose to think about. I decided the safest thing was to move west, get out of the territory, and find a way to send the ledger ahead of me." She paused. "But Thomas Aldrich died, and Voss's men had already picked up my trail. I've seen riders behind us twice since Harlan County. The lamp between them hummed softly. Outside, the wind had dropped to something that was almost quiet. Gideon looked at the ledger sitting there on the desk. He looked at the woman across from him. The fine-cut exhaustion in her face, the way she was holding herself with a precision that he recognized now as controlled fear. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for her brother and sister, and she was channeling that fear into the one thing she could control, which was information delivery. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because if Voss's men tracked us here, you're already involved whether you know it or not." She said it without apology. "And because you've been decent to us, and you deserve to know what you've let in your door." He looked at her for a long time. She met his gaze without flinching, without performing anything. She was just watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he was going to turn out to be. He had not thought about that question, what kind of man he was, in a long time. He had not thought there was enough left of him to make it meaningful. "Is there anyone in Denver you trust?" he said. "Someone who can actually do something with this ledger?" She blinked. It was the first moment of genuine surprise he'd seen from her. There's a federal land agent, a man named Corbett. He's been trying to build a case against Voss's holding companies for 2 years, but he hasn't had enough documentation. He'd have enough with this? My father believed so. Gideon put his hand on the desk, not on the ledger, just near it. Then we'll get it to him. But first we need to get through this winter, and we need to know how close Voss's people actually are. May stared at him. You're not going to tell us to leave. No. This isn't your fight. He picked up his pencil and looked at it. You said yourself I'm already in it. He glanced at her. Besides, I know what Voss does to people's land. I've watched 3 families lose their ranches in this county in the last 4 years. Couldn't prove anything. He set the pencil down. Now, maybe I can. She was quiet for a long moment. Something in her face moved, not softened exactly, but shifted. Like something she'd been holding had been allowed to settle somewhere slightly less urgent. Thank you, she said. For the second time. And this time it didn't cost her as much. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when Corbett has the ledger in his hands and you're all still breathing. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She stood and picked up the satchel. I'll let you finish your accounting. May. She stopped in the doorway. He looked at the ledger he hadn't touched. Keep that on you, not in the room. On you. She patted the satchel. Always. Then she was gone. He sat in the study for a while after. He wasn't thinking about Voss exactly, or the ledger, or the logistics of getting a document to a federal agent across a blizzard-locked territory. He was thinking about a boy humming a tune in the dark, about a 4-year-old with opinions about fish coats, about a woman who had walked through a blizzard with 2 children and a ledger that could get her killed, who had sat across from him and told him the truth without being asked, and without dressing it up as anything other than what it was. He got up. He turned down the lamp. He went upstairs. And for the first time in a long time, he slept until morning. The storm broke on Thursday, as Gideon had said it would, not gently. It didn't taper off the way some storms did, losing conviction gradually, thinning from blizzard to flurry to gray drizzle over the course of a day. This one held its full force until sometime in the early hours of Thursday morning and then simply stopped, as if a door had been closed somewhere up in the mountains. Gideon was awake when it happened. He heard the wind quit and lay in the dark listening to the silence that replaced it, which was so complete after 4 days of noise that it had a kind of weight to it. He got up before dawn and went outside. The snow was chest-high against the north-facing walls of the barn and had buried the lower rail of every fence on the property. The sky above was black and absolutely clear, stars hard and bright in a way that only happened at altitude after a front had scoured the air clean. His breath made clouds. The cold was savage, but still, and still was manageable. By the time he'd finished the morning check on the cattle, the sun was coming up pink over the eastern ridge, and Finn was in the yard with a shovel that was nearly as tall as he was, working on the path between the house and the barn, with the focused determination of someone who had decided this was their job now. He hadn't been asked. He just found the shovel in the lean-to and started. Gideon watched him for a moment from across the yard. You don't have to do that, he said. Finn didn't look up. I know, he said, and kept shoveling. It was, Gideon thought, one of the more honest conversations he'd had in recent memory. May was at the table when he came in for breakfast, and she had the ledger open. Not reading it. She clearly knew every page already. But cross-checking something against a piece of paper she'd written herself, a hand-drawn map of county lines that she'd constructed from memory. She closed it when he came in, not quickly, not in a way that suggested she was hiding it from him specifically, just the instinctive caution of a woman who'd been protecting that document for months. Roads will be passable by tomorrow, he said. Day after, at the latest. She nodded. We should talk about getting word to Corbett. I've been thinking about that. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. Riding to Denver is 2 days in good weather. Right now the passes will be dangerous for at least a week. We could send a wire from Millhaven. That's the nearest town with a telegraph office. But I don't know how secure that line is. It's not, she said flatly. Voss has people at telegraph offices in 4 towns I know of. Clerks who'll copy a message and have it on a rider before the ink dries. He hadn't known the extent of it. He thought he should have, and the gap in his knowledge irritated him. Then we need someone we trust to carry a letter in person. Do you have someone like that? He thought about it honestly, which meant acknowledging that his world had narrowed considerably in the last 3 years. There were people he'd once trusted. Some of them had drifted away in the way that people drift away from grief. Not unkindly, just unable to sustain the closeness when the person they'd known wasn't quite there anymore. Silas has a nephew in Pueblo, he said. Works for the Territorial Land Office. He's not Corbett, but he'd know how to get a letter to the right person without it going through the wrong ones first. But May considered this. That could work. She paused. But it means staying here until the letter reaches someone who can act on it. That's weeks, maybe. I know. You understand what that means. If Voss's men tracked us to this county, they'll eventually track us to this ranch. I know that too. She looked at him with an expression he was coming to recognize, not skepticism, exactly, more like she was taking a careful measurement of something. You're not worried. I didn't say that. He set down his cup. I said I know. Knowing and worrying are different things. She was quiet for a moment. My father used to say something like that. He didn't ask what her father had been like. He thought she'd tell him when she wanted to and not before. We'll get word to Silas's nephew today, he said. And in the meantime, I want to know everything that's in that ledger. Not the legal details. I can read those myself. I want to know how Voss operates, what his pattern is, how much time we're likely to have before he moves. She opened the ledger again. Then you'd better get more coffee, she said. This is going to take a while. It took most of the morning. May walked him through it with the methodical clarity of someone who had organized this information in her head until she could deliver it in any order, from any starting point, without losing the thread. Her father had been right. Cassian Voss was not a simple criminal. He was a system. The way it worked, as May explained it, was layered. Voss would identify a property, usually a ranch or farmstead with some particular value, good water rights, mineral potential, or a strategic position near a railroad route that hadn't been announced publicly yet. He'd begin with legitimate inquiries. A fair offer, rejected or accepted, didn't matter. If the owner sold, fine. If they didn't, the second layer began. He has a man, May said. Different names in different counties. A legal specialist. He finds the weakest point in the property's documentation. A survey discrepancy, a gap in the title chain, an ambiguity in an old deed. And he exploits it. Sometimes he bribes the county record keeper to alter a document by a date or a measurement. Sometimes he manufactures a prior claim and files it in a county where no one checks carefully. And if the owner fights it, they fight it in court, which costs money and takes years. By the time a judgment comes down, the owner is usually either bankrupt or has been pressured into selling at a loss to end the litigation. What kind of pressure? She looked at him steadily. The kind that doesn't leave marks on paper, broken equipment, sick cattle, fires in haystacks. She paused. Accidents. Like a man falling downstairs. Gideon turned a page in the ledger. His father-in-law had owned a property on the western edge of the county, or had for a few years before he'd been convinced to sell it under circumstances that had never quite sat right. He'd thought it was just a bad deal taken under financial stress. Now he was less certain. The 9 ranches you mentioned, he said, in 3 territories. What happened to the families? Most of them scattered. Some moved to towns. 2 families I know of lost everything and had children to feed and took whatever work they could find. Her voice was even. One man, a rancher named Obert Pickens in Nevada Territory, refused to leave after the court ruled against him. His house burned 6 weeks after the judgment. He got his family out. The house didn't survive. Pickens, Gideon said. Is that in the ledger? Page 47. My father documented the fire, the timing relative to the court ruling, the insurance claim that Voss's holding company filed on the property 2 weeks later. She paused. My father was thorough. He sounds like it. Gideon looked at the page. The handwriting was precise and small, the entries dated, cross-referenced in the margins. A careful man's work. A man who'd understood that the truth was only as useful as its documentation. How long had he been keeping this? He started making notes almost 3 years ago. He sent copies of some documents to himself under a false name at a postal address in Cincinnati. That's what the second section of the ledger is. Receipts for those mailings, with the false name and address. If something happened to the original documents, the copies could be retrieved. Gideon looked at her. Your father was thinking about this as a legal case from the beginning. Yes. Something crossed her face, not grief exactly, more like a complicated respect that had nowhere left to go. He knew he couldn't go to local authorities. Half of them are on Voss's payroll. He was building something that would hold up in a federal court. He just ran out of time. The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, he could hear Finn still working, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel against frozen ground. Rose had found Silas in the barn and was apparently conducting some kind of inspection of the horses because he could hear her voice periodically, high and decisive, and Silas's low responses. Your father built something that might actually work, Gideon said. That's not nothing. May closed the ledger. It's everything, she said quietly, and I intend to make sure it counts. That afternoon, Silas rode out toward Millhaven with a letter for his nephew. Gideon had written it himself, brief and carefully worded. No names for Voss, referred to only as the party in question. No location names beyond Pueblo. Instructions for passing the information along through known channels. May had read it over before he sealed it and suggested 2 changes, both of which made it harder to trace if intercepted. He'd made them without argument. While Silas was gone, Gideon had the hands begin the post-storm work on the fences and water troughs, keeping them busy and close to the property. He didn't tell them why he wanted them close. He said it was because there was too much storm damage to address, and he needed the labor, which was true enough. But he also walked the perimeter himself that afternoon, on horseback, looking at the property from its edges the way he hadn't in years. Not as the owner surveying his land, but as a man assessing a defensive position. He looked at the access roads, the sight lines from the ridge, the places where a group of riders could approach without being visible from the house until they were close. There were more of those than he liked. He found a set of tracks on the eastern boundary fence line. They were partially filled with snow. Whatever had made them had been there during the blizzard or just before. But they were there. A horse, unshod or reshod with plain iron, and a boot print near the fence post where someone had dismounted and stood for a while, standing and looking at the ranch house. He didn't mention it to May that evening. He told himself it was because he didn't want to worry her before he had more information, which was partly true. The other part was that he needed to think it through first, and he was still learning how to think things through with other people in the house. It had been a long time since his decisions had carried weight for anyone other than himself. Silas came back after dark and reported that the telegraph operator in Millhaven, a woman named Denise Greer who'd held the job for 9 years, had looked at him with recognition when he'd mentioned the name Corbett in an offhand way. Apparently Corbett had people throughout the territory keeping their ears open. Silas's nephew wasn't even necessary. Denise Greer would know how to route the letter. Can we trust her? May asked. She joined them in the kitchen when Silas came in, and she sat at the table with her arms folded. Silas trusts her, Gideon said. I've known her 20 years, Silas said. Her husband was a land surveyor who lost his certification when he refused to falsify a boundary report for a development company. They've been scrambling ever since. He sat down and poured himself a cup of the coffee May had kept hot. She's not doing this for money. She's doing it because she's been waiting for someone to actually move on Voss's operation for 2 years. May was quiet for a moment, turning this over. All right, she said. All right. She unfolded her arms. How long before Corbett could act on it? Weeks, Silas said honestly. Maybe a month. Federal cases don't move fast. A month, she repeated. If he's already built most of the case, Gideon said, the ledger might be the piece that closes it. He might move faster than we think. He looked at her. But we plan for a month, and we assume Voss's people are already watching. He told them about the tracks. He'd decided on the ride back that not telling them was the wrong choice. May in particular needed to know, because the decision about what to do next was not his alone to make. This was her situation as much as it was his. More, really. She didn't react the way he'd half expected, with fear or alarm. She absorbed it in a way that made him wonder how many things she'd been absorbing calmly over the past months that would have made a different person come apart. How many riders? She asked. 1, from what I could read, probably a scout. So they know we're here. They haven't moved yet because... She stopped, working through it. Because Voss doesn't move until he has to. He's careful. He'll want to be sure the ledger is here before he sends anyone. That's how I read it. Which means we have a little time. She sat forward. We need to make this ranch as difficult to approach quietly as possible. And we need at least one person who can ride to town quickly, if it comes to that. I have 3 hands, Gideon said. Hargrove got snowed in town and came back this morning. All 3 are capable men. They know how to shoot? This is Colorado, he said. Everyone knows how to shoot. Silas snorted into But's coffee. May almost smiled. That almost that Gideon had noticed before, the expression that got close to something warmer and then pulled back. We'll need to tell them something, she said. Not everything, but enough that they're not caught by surprise. I'll handle that, Gideon said. And Finn and Rose, she said. Her voice changed slightly, not softened, but recalibrated. They need to know what to do if something happens. Where to go. Finn, especially. He's 12! He's 12, and he's smart, and he'll handle it better knowing than not knowing. She said it with the certainty of someone who had made this determination already and wasn't going to revisit it. He's been protecting Rose since he was 9 years old. Don't underestimate him. Gideon said nothing to that. He thought of the boy shoveling in the pre-dawn dark, finding the work, and doing it without being asked. All right, he said. We tell him. He told Finn the next morning. Not the full story, not Voss's name, not all the details of the ledger. But enough. Some men might come to the ranch. If that happened, Finn's job was to get Rose to the old root cellar beneath the North Pasture outbuilding and stay there, and not come out until May or Gideon or Silas came for them personally. He showed Finn where the cellar was and how to latch it from inside. He showed him how to get there from the house by the shortest route. Finn listened to all of it without interrupting. When Gideon finished, the boy nodded once. I know how to use a rifle, Finn said. He wasn't bragging. He was just offering relevant information. I know, Gideon said, but your job isn't to fight. Your job is Rose. Finn looked at him for a long moment. What if they get between me and May? It was not the question of a child who didn't understand what he was being told. Gideon answered it straight. Then you trust that May and I can handle ourselves. And you keep going to the cellar. You don't double back for us. He held the boy's gaze. You hear me? Yeah, Finn said. He looked down at the cellar door, then back up. She worries about us more than she worries about herself. I know. She always has. He said it without resentment, just as a fact he'd lived with for a long time. She gave up a lot to take care of us. After our father. He stopped himself, a slight tightening of the jaw. She doesn't like people to know that. I won't tell her you said it, Gideon said. Finn studied him with those 2 old eyes. You like her, he said. Not accusingly. Carefully, like he was still deciding how he felt about the information. Gideon didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for him. She's a capable woman, he said, which was true, and said nothing. Finn appeared to accept this for what it was. He looked back at the cellar door. I'll remember the route, he said, and that was the end of it. The days that followed had a strange double quality. On the surface, the ranch ran the way ranches run in winter, livestock managed, equipment maintained, the slow, unglamorous work of keeping animals alive and infrastructure functional through cold that had opinions. Gideon and his hands worked the fences in the mornings. May helped in the afternoons. Finn was essentially a 4th ranch hand by the end of the first week, not because anyone had promoted him to it, but because he kept turning up where the work was. Silas had started teaching him to read the cattle, how to see a sick animal before it showed obvious symptoms, how to tell the difference between a heifer that was cold and one that was in genuine distress. Rose learned the names of all 6 horses. She reported this to Gideon at breakfast one morning as if it were an administrative matter requiring his acknowledgement. Even the gray? He said. His name is Albert, she said. The gray's name was actually Dust, and he'd had it for 7 years, but he didn't correct her. Beneath the surface, everything was taut. Gideon had positioned one of the hands, Hargrove, the quietest and most reliable of the 3, on a rotating watch along the eastern boundary, the most likely approach from the direction of the Aldrich property and the main road. He'd done it without calling it a watch. He'd said he wanted regular checks on the far fence line because the snow damage had been worse there. Hargrove, who was not a fool, had said yes, sir, and done it without asking questions, which was exactly what Gideon needed. He'd also moved the ledger. May had been keeping it in the leather satchel she carried everywhere, but Gideon argued that if something happened to her specifically, they'd lose the document. He suggested they make a copy, a partial copy at least, and keep it separate. She'd resisted at first, the resistance of someone who'd been the sole guardian of something for so long that sharing the responsibility felt like a kind of failure. It's not about trust, he said. It's about risk distribution. She'd looked at him for a long moment. My father used that exact phrase. Smart man, stubborn man, she said, but she'd agreed. They'd spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table, May reading from the ledger and Gideon writing the most critical sections out in a clean hand on separate pages. When they were finished, he sealed the copy in an oilskin packet and hid it in the false floor of the tack room that he'd built himself 15 years ago, and that nobody else on the property knew existed. Those evenings at the kitchen table were something Gideon found himself thinking about afterward. Not the work itself. The work was tedious, and his handwriting was never good, and May had corrected his spelling twice without comment. But the quality of the time. May would read a passage, and he'd write it out, and there'd be stretches of focused quiet. And then she'd pause to explain something about a particular transaction, and they'd end up talking through the implication of it, and somehow 40 minutes would pass. She had a sharp mind, not schooled in formal law, but deeply practical, the kind of intelligence that comes from reading closely and thinking carefully, and actually trying to understand things rather than just holding the information. She told him more about her father in pieces, not intentionally, but the way it comes out when you're doing something else. A detail dropped into the context of explaining a document, a memory sparked by something he said. The man had been a reader. History, mostly, and legal texts, and an occasional novel that he'd read aloud to the children in the evenings. He'd taught May accounting by accident, showing her how to reconcile the household ledger when she was 10, because she was curious, and he found it easier to teach than to explain why she couldn't learn. He sounds like someone who should have been a lawyer, Gideon said. He wanted to be, May said. Couldn't afford the schooling. She turned a page. So he did what he could with what he had, which is generally what you do. It was said without self-pity or philosophy, just a fact, which was maybe the most honest thing he'd heard anyone say in years. Is that why you came west? He asked. Not just for Aldrich, for this. She considered the question for longer than he expected. Partly, she said. There was nothing left in Harlan County. Voss's people had made that clear, and I couldn't go anywhere safe until the ledger was in the right hands. She traced the edge of the page with one finger. But also, I don't know. Aldrich's letters were decent. He sounded like a decent man. He said there was land and work and room to build something. Mum. She stopped. I was tired of managing a decline. I wanted to go somewhere with the possibility of forward movement. He understood that in a way he hadn't expected to. What about you? She said. This place. You stay. It's mine, he said. That's not why, she said, not accusingly. With the directness she deployed when she had an opinion and had decided it was worth stating. He was quiet for a moment. No, he agreed. It's not the only reason. He didn't say the rest of it. She didn't push. She went back to reading from the ledger, and he went back to writing, and the lamp between them burned down another quarter-inch. 12 days after the blizzard broke, Hargrove came in from the fence line at a trot, not running, but faster than his usual pace, and found Gideon in the barn. Riders on the eastern road, Hargrove said. His voice was even. He was that kind of man. 3 of them, moving slow. They stopped at the boundary marker for maybe 10 minutes, and then one turned back and the other 2 kept coming. Armed? Couldn't say from that distance, but they weren't carrying anything visible in their hands, which meant they might have rifles in their scabbards or pistols under their coats, and there was no way to know until they were closer. How far back? 20 minutes, riding slow. Gideon set down the harness he'd been working on. He thought for exactly 1 moment, not about what to do. He'd already worked that out in his head 2 days after finding the boot prints, but about the order of doing it. Get the other 2, he said. Bring them to the front of the house. Act normal. We're ranchers who've had no particular trouble and have no reason to expect any. Hargrove nodded and went. Gideon went to the house. May was in the kitchen with Finn, going over something at the table, and she looked up when he came in and immediately read his face. She said nothing, just looked at him. "2 riders coming," he said. "Probably scouts, same as before, but I don't want to assume. Get Rose." May was already moving. "Finn," she said. Her voice had gone flat and clear, a register Gideon hadn't heard before. "You remember what we talked about?" "Yes," Finn said. He stood up from the table. He was already in his coat from being outside earlier. He didn't need to ask questions. "Root cellar," May said. "Both of you, don't come out." "May, don't argue with me right now." She touched his face once, briefly, in a way that said everything she didn't have time to say. "Go." Rose appeared from the back room dragging a cloth rabbit that was missing one ear. Finn took her hand with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. He looked at Gideon once, a quick, measuring look, and then he took his sister toward the back of the house. Gideon and May went to the front window. The 2 riders were visible now at the end of the approach road, coming at a walk. They were dressed in trail clothes, heavy coats, wide hats, and they sat their horses with the casual ease of men who were accustomed to showing up in places and seeing what they could see. "Do you recognize them?" Gideon asked. May studied them for a long moment. "The one on the gray," she said. "I saw him outside our house in Harlan County, twice." So they'd found her, or confirmed her location. They'd probably known since the boot prints, and these 2 were here to look at the layout, count the hands, see what they were dealing with before reporting back. He stepped away from the window. He put on a settled, unhurried expression, the expression of a man who runs a ranch and expects no trouble today, and walked to the front door. "Stay inside," he said. "No," May said. He looked at her. "If I hide, they know I'm here and I'm afraid." She met his eyes steadily. "If I stand next to you on that porch, I'm just a woman at a ranch. They can't be sure." It was not a bad point. He turned it over quickly. "Stay 1 step behind me," he said, "and let me talk first." She nodded. He opened the door and walked onto the porch. The 2 riders came up to the gate at the front of the yard and stopped. The one May had recognized, broad through the shoulders, dark beard, eyes that did a quick inventory of the porch and the yard and the barn with the practiced efficiency of a man whose job required it, spoke first. "Afternoon," he said. Friendly enough. The word was a door held open to see if you'd walk through it. "Afternoon," Gideon said. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his weight easy. "Something I can do for you?" "Just riding through," the man said. "Wondered if we could water the horses." "Troughs around the side." Gideon nodded toward it. "Help yourselves." The man's eyes moved to May, taking her in. Just a glance, but a thorough one. "Thank you kindly," he said. He looked back at Gideon. "You the owner of this property?" "That's right, Gideon Hale." "Nice spread," the man said. His eyes moved across the barn, the bunkhouse, the pasture fence, counting things. "You been here long?" "Long enough." Gideon said it pleasantly, and it came out like the end of a topic rather than an invitation to continue. The man looked at May one more time. "Your wife?" It was a test. May said nothing. She stood where she was, 1 step back and slightly to his left, and her expression was the expression of a woman who was cold and would rather be back inside and had no particular feelings about strangers passing through. "Yes," Gideon said. The word came out of him without calculation. It was just there, clear and simple. And he felt May go very still in his peripheral vision, but she didn't move or speak. The man held Gideon's gaze for a moment. Then he smiled, a real smile, or a good imitation of one, and touched the brim of his hat. "Appreciate the water," he said. "You have a good afternoon." "You too," Gideon said. The 2 riders moved around to the water trough. They watered their horses without hurry, without talking to each other, without looking at the house again. Then they rode back out the way they'd come. Gideon and May stood on the porch until they were out of sight. The afternoon was bright and cold and perfectly still. "Your wife," May said, after a long moment. Her voice was neutral. "It was the fastest answer," he said. She was quiet. "Was it?" He looked at her. She was watching the empty road. Her jaw was set in a way he recognized now as the way she held herself when she was turning something over and hadn't decided what to do with it yet. "It was the answer that kept you safest," he said. "If they're looking for a woman traveling alone with 2 children, you're not her. And if they check?" "There's no county record to check against yet," he said, "which gives us time." She turned and looked at him. He couldn't read her expression exactly. It was somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated that she didn't have a name for or wasn't willing to give one. "We need to write to Corbett's contact again," she said. "Faster." "Yes," he said. "We do." She turned and went back inside. He stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the road and listening to the quiet that lay over the valley like something held, like a breath not yet released. The second letter went out the next morning, carried by Silas himself on his fastest horse, with instructions to ride straight through to Millhaven and not stop for anything short of a broken leg. Gideon had rewritten it twice in the early hours before dawn, May sitting across from him and watching each draft with the attention of someone reading a legal brief. The letter said less than the first one and meant more. It named Voss directly, described 2 specific fraudulent transactions from the ledger with enough detail that Corbett's people could cross-reference them against federal records, and stated plainly that the primary documentation was secure and in the hands of a witness prepared to testify. May had insisted on that last part. Gideon had argued it gave away too much. She'd said if they were going to do this, they needed Corbett to understand it was real and not another dead-end tip from someone who'd heard rumors. He'd looked at her for a moment and then written it the way she'd said. Silas made it back by nightfall. Denise Greer had taken the letter, read the opening line, and told him to tell Gideon that her husband sent his regards, which was Silas's way of conveying that she understood exactly what she was holding and would get it where it needed to go. "How long did she think?" Gideon asked. "She didn't say a number. She said, soon as it can be." It wasn't a timeline, but it was something. Each it. The trouble with waiting was that it required a kind of sustained vigilance that was different from ordinary caution. Ordinary caution was instinct. You saw something wrong, and you responded. What they were doing now was something else, holding themselves at a level of readiness for a threat that hadn't arrived yet and might come from any direction. It wore on people in different ways. Hargrove got quieter than usual, which for Hargrove was practically silence. One of the other hands, a younger man named Cord, started double-checking the latch on the bunkhouse door at night, which he'd never done before. Even the horses seemed unsettled, stirring in their stalls in the small hours at sounds that turned out to be wind or nothing. May moved differently. Gideon noticed it the way he noticed most things about her now. Not all at once, but in accumulation, detail by detail. She'd started spending less time at the table with the ledger and more time outside, walking the perimeter of the yard, watching the road from the kitchen window at intervals she probably didn't realize were regular. She still did the work. She was constitutionally incapable of not doing the work, as near as he could tell, but there was a layer of attention she was keeping on the horizon that hadn't been there before the 2 riders came. He found her at the fence line of the south pasture one afternoon, 6 days after the scouts' visit. She was looking east, not at anything specific, just east. "They'll come back," she said, without turning. She'd heard him approach. She always heard him, even in mud, which he wasn't sure whether to be impressed by or concerned about. "Probably," he said. "Not just scouts this time." He stood beside her at the fence. The south pasture ran down to a tree line along a dry creek bed, and beyond that the land opened up into the broad valley that eventually found the main road. Clear day like today, you could see the road, a brown line at the edge of visibility. Nothing on it. "You said Voss is careful," Gideon said, "that he waits until he's sure. He's had 3 weeks since the storm. Long enough to confirm we're here, long enough to get impatient." She turned to look at him. "How many men can he put in a place like this on short notice?" "In this county, I don't know exactly. He has ranch hands on the properties he's already taken, hired security." He'd been thinking about this. "A dozen, maybe. 15 if he pulls from neighboring counties. And us? 4 hands plus me and Silas. 6 if I count you." She held his gaze. "Count me." He nodded once. He'd already counted her. "We can't match them on numbers," she said. "No, but we have walls and we know the property, and they have to come to us. He looked at the tree line. The problem is the barn. If they get to the barn first, they can use it as cover and work toward the house from 20 yards. And the animals. And the animals, he agreed. He'd thought about this more than he'd slept in the past week. She was quiet for a moment. My father had a phrase, she said. When he was dealing with something at the records office that had too many moving pieces, he'd say, "Name the thing you can't afford to lose and protect that first." She looked at the house. For us, that's the ledger and the children. Finn and Rose are fastest to the cellar from the kitchen door, he said. 20 seconds if they run. Finn knows. I know he knows. I want to run it again with them. Not to frighten them. Just so it's as automatic as breathing. He looked at her. Agree? She said yes without hesitation. They practiced it that evening. Not dramatically. Gideon simply told Finn and Rose that they were going to play a game where they had to get from the kitchen to the cellar as fast as they could. Rose treated it with the seriousness of an athletic competition and made Finn time her twice. She was faster the second time. She was extremely pleased about this. Finn timed it with his jaw set and his eyes clear, and when it was done, he told Rose she'd done well. And then he looked at Gideon with an expression that said he understood precisely what this was and was managing it. You okay? Gideon asked him quietly when Rose was out of range. I'm okay, Finn said. He said it the same flat way Gideon said fine, which meant he wasn't okay, but he was capable. And right now, capable was what mattered. The night it happened was not the night Gideon expected. He'd been half expecting an early morning approach, the traditional choice, when men are in the lowest depths of sleep and reaction time is slowest. He'd adjusted the watch schedule for it, having Hargrove on from 2 in the morning and himself up by 4. He'd been doing this for 9 days. What he hadn't fully prepared for was a moonless night in the second week of November, when the cloud cover came in low and fast, and by 8 in the evening, the world outside the windows was the specific black of having no reference points at all. He was in the study when he heard the first sound. Not a gunshot, not shouting, but the horses. Not the usual nighttime restlessness. This was a different register, a high agitation that cut through the walls and hit some old animal part of his brain and had him on his feet before he'd consciously processed what it meant. He was in the hallway pulling on his coat when May came out of her room already dressed. She slept in her clothes now, had been doing it for a week. She had the satchel over her shoulder. Horses, she said. I heard. They moved to the front window. The yard was impenetrably dark. Then Gideon's eyes picked up something. A movement at the edge of the barn. 2 shapes, too deliberate to be livestock. They're already at the barn, he said. The word went through him with a cold efficiency that wasn't quite fear. He turned from the window. Get the children, he said. Already. May was already past him, moving toward the back of the house. He went to the gun cabinet. He'd moved it to the front room 2 days ago, unlocked, loaded. A decision he'd made quietly because having a loaded gun accessible in a house with children felt wrong, and having an empty gun when you needed it felt worse. He took the rifle and checked the load. He took the revolver from the shelf beside it and went to the back room where May was pulling Rose out of bed. Rose was awake immediately, no crying, blinking in the dark with the serious expression of a child who had picked up on the fact that the adults were moving very fast. Finn was already up, boots on, coat in hand. Now, May said, run. Finn picked up Rose and went. May followed to the kitchen door and watched them cross the dark yard to the outbuilding. 20 seconds, maybe 18. Gideon counted without meaning to. Then a gunshot, from the direction of the bunkhouse. Then another, and then suddenly multiple, close together, and the specific shattering crack of a window somewhere in the house. Gideon dropped below the windowsill and came up to look. He could see muzzle flash from the edge of the yard, from behind the stock fence, from the far side of the water trough. They'd positioned around the perimeter before opening up, which meant this was organized, which meant Voss had sent people who knew what they were doing. He fired once toward the muzzle flash by the water trough. Not expecting to hit anything, he couldn't see a target, only light, but establishing that there was return fire. From the bunkhouse came voices, Hargrove's, clipped and clear, directing the other 2. They were returning fire from the bunkhouse windows. That meant the 3 hands were pinned in the bunkhouse and unable to reach the house, which meant it was him and May on this side. May was beside him. She had the revolver he'd given her 2 days ago. She'd held it like she'd held one before, confirmed she knew the basics, not made a performance of it either way. She was at the edge of the other window, watching. 7, at least, she said. Her voice was startling in its steadiness. 2 at the fence, 2 behind the trough. I think 2 more at the barn, and at least 1 coming around the north side of the house. How do you... I've been counting the flashes. She looked at him. The one on the north side is going to reach the kitchen door in about a minute. He moved. He went through the house to the kitchen at a low run, got behind the heavy table he'd dragged against the back wall yesterday, a preparation May had noted without comment, and waited. The kitchen door opened. The man who came through it was big, backlit by a fraction of something from outside, and he was inside before he'd adjusted to the dark well enough to see Gideon at the table. He was still adjusting when Gideon moved from behind the table with the rifle's stock and put him down. Not gently. The man went down and didn't immediately get back up. Gideon didn't have time to wait for eventually. He took the man's pistol from the floor beside him and went back to the front room. May was still at the window. "They're pushing on the barn," she said, and now there was something in her voice. Not fear exactly, but the edge of something controlled very tightly. "I can see fire." He looked. There was light coming from the barn. Orange, wrong, the particular moving quality of something active. The barn was burning. He had 6 horses in that barn. One of them was the mare with the stone bruise who'd never been moved to the winter pasture. One of them was the gray that Rose had named Albert. He stood and watched the barn burn and felt a particular cold fury that was nothing like panic. "We have to get the horses out," he said. "If we go out there..." "I know." He knew exactly what going out there meant. He went anyway. "Stay inside. Keep the front window." "Gideon..." "May." He turned to look at her. The fire from the barn was bright enough now that there was light in the room, and he could see her face clearly. She was afraid, not for herself, he didn't think, but for what she could see in his face, which was a man who had lost too much in 3 years and was not going to stand in a house and watch his barn burn. "I'll be fast," he said. "Keep the front window." She looked at him for one long second. Then she turned back to the window. "2 by the fence are moving east," she said. "You have maybe 30 seconds before they have an angle on the barn door." He went out the back, low, moving in the direction that kept the house between him and the fence. The cold hit him the way cold always did when you'd been in a heated space. Sharp, immediate, clarifying. He could hear shouting now, from multiple directions, and the crackle of the fire was louder outside. The barn roof wasn't fully caught yet, but the south wall was. He got to the barn's north door, the small door, not the main entrance, and got inside. The smoke was thin enough still to see, and the horses were frantic, all 6 of them, slamming against their stall doors and screaming in the particular way horses scream that bypasses thought and goes straight to something older and worse. He unlatched the first stall, and the horse blew past him before the door was fully open. He went to the next one, then the next. He got 5 horses out. The 6th, a bay gelding, old, slow, he had to half drag by the halter into the night air. The gelding didn't want to come. Gideon understood this in some abstract way and had no time for it. He got the horse to the fence of the north pasture and got the gate open and the horse through it, and by the time he turned around, the barn was showing through the roof in 2 places and the orange light of it threw long shadows across the yard. He heard a shout from the direction of the fence, then a shot that hit the fence post 2 feet from his head. He went to the ground and moved. There was a boulder at the northwest corner of the yard, glacial, enormous, the kind of thing that had been there since before anyone could remember, and had been too heavy to move when the yard was first laid out, so it had simply been incorporated. Gideon had climbed it as a boy. He knew its surfaces better than most people knew their own furniture. He got behind it and caught his breath and looked at where the shot had come from. 2 men. Coming across the open ground between the burning barn and the house, using the fire's backlight against anyone trying to see them. Smart positioning. The fire made the yard between the barn and the house into a lit kill zone for anyone trying to cross it, and they were positioning to control that zone. He didn't have a clean shot from the boulder. They were angling toward the front of the house. The front of the house was where May was. He went around the boulder on the north side, kept the rock between himself and the fire, moved along the fence line toward the front. He could hear from the bunkhouse that the firefight there was ongoing. Hargrove still shooting, which meant at least one of the hands was still functional. He came around the corner of the house and saw one of the two men at the front porch steps, not climbing them yet, standing, looking at the front window. The second man was behind him, watching the yard. May opened the front window. For one moment that stretched badly, Gideon thought she was doing something wrong, something reactive and dangerous. Then he saw what she'd done. She'd picked up the man from the kitchen, the one Gideon had put down. Or rather, she'd picked up that man's rifle, which she'd apparently retrieved while Gideon was at the barn, and she was using the window frame as a brace, and she was not aiming at the man on the steps. She was aiming at the second man, the one watching the yard, the one who would shoot Gideon the moment Gideon moved into the open to reach the first man. She fired. The second man went down. Gideon moved from the corner of the house. The first man turned, heard him coming, started to raise his weapon, and Gideon hit him low and drove him into the porch railing. The railing broke. They went down the steps together. Gideon got on top, and the man was big and not done. And for 30 ugly seconds it was close quarters work that had nothing to do with tactics or planning, just the awful physical reality of two people fighting in the dirt. Gideon was not a young man. He was 41 years old and running on cold fury and 9 days without enough sleep, and the man under him was younger and had the particular strength of someone paid to hit people. But Gideon was angrier. He got the man's gun arm pinned. He got his forearm across the man's throat. He held him there until the fight went out of him. He was breathing hard when he stood up. The man stayed down. Gideon picked up the fallen revolver and looked at the yard. The shooting had stopped. Not entirely. There were still sounds from the far side of the property, one more shot from near the bunkhouse, but the organized pressure of it had broken. He could hear shouting in the distance, a voice he didn't recognize yelling something, and then the sound of horses departing fast on the eastern road. The barn was fully lit now. The roof was gone on the south end. The fire threw light across the entire yard, and it was, in its terrible way, completely visible. The overturned water trough where someone had sheltered, and then apparently abandoned, the boot tracks in the mud near the fence, the two men who were down and not running. Silas came out of the dark from the direction of the main road. He was limping, and his coat was torn, and he had a rifle in each hand and an expression of contained rage. "Where'd you come from?" Gideon said. "Was already on the road when they hit," Silas said. "I heard the shots and came back around the long way. Put two off their horses on the east fence." He looked at the barn. His jaw tightened. "The horses?" "Pasture, all 6. Gideon looked at him. "You're bleeding." "I know." Silas said it the way Gideon said fine. "Where's May?" "House." As if she'd heard her name, she probably had. The door was open. May appeared on the porch. She had the rifle still, carried down at her side, and she looked at Silas and then at Gideon, and then at the yard with the inventory assessment of someone cataloging what had changed. The barn burning, 2 men on the ground, Silas limping, Gideon with his coat torn at the shoulder where it had caught on the porch railing. "Hargrove," she said. "Still up," Silas said. Cord took a graze on his arm, nothing critical. The young hand, Petrie, was in the bunkhouse and kept his head. May nodded. She came down the porch steps. She didn't ask Gideon if he was all right. She looked at him in the firelight with an attention that covered that ground without the words, taking in the torn coat and the scrape along his jaw from the fall down the porch steps, and then she looked away and said, "We need to get those men tied before one of them decides to be a problem." "Yes," he said. They used fence wire, which was not elegant but was available. Hargrove came out from the bunkhouse and helped, moving with the stiff efficiency of a man who has been in a confined space under fire for 20 minutes and is glad to have room to breathe. Cord was behind him with his left arm wrapped in a strip of his own shirt, his face pale but coherent. There were 2 men down in the yard, 1 in the kitchen, and 2 more that Silas reported from the east fence, 5 accounted for. Gideon didn't know how many had ridden away. The barn burned itself down to its foundation over the next 2 hours. There was nothing to be done about it. They kept the house wet. Finn appeared at one point, unauthorized, to help carry water from the trough, and May looked at him and appeared to calculate that telling him to stop was a battle she wasn't going to win. And they made sure no sparks reached the house roof, and they let the barn go. Gideon stood and watched it. Silas stood beside him. "Voss will have gotten word by now," Silas said. He'd let May wrap his side. A laceration from something, possibly a ricochet fragment, nothing life-threatening, and he was sitting on an upturned crate by the water trough. Either his people reported back or the ones that rode off did. How long before he moves himself? Depends how much he values the ledger against the risk. Silas looked at the coals. In my experience, men like Voss don't come personally. They send layers. He's sent 2 layers already. Gideon watched an ember drift up from the ruin and die in the cold air. He might decide to come look at the problem himself. Or he might go legal, cut his losses on the direct approach and try to tie you up in court instead. Silas shifted carefully, favoring his wrapped side. He still doesn't have the ledger. No. Gideon had checked. The oilskin packet in the tack room floor was intact. The tack room itself had been untouched. Whoever had set the barn fire had done it from outside on the south wall, probably with the intention of driving everyone into the open, and hadn't known about the tack room's secondary storage. The ledger May carried was with her. He could see the satchel strap on her shoulder from here. From the direction of the house, he heard Rose's voice. May had gotten her out of the cellar during the cleanup, and Rose had emerged with the cloth rabbit and an absolutely no-nonsense assessment of the situation that had included asking where Albert was. Albert was in the north pasture with 5 other horses, all of them agitated and alive. Finn had confirmed this personally and reported it to Rose with the solemnity of a military dispatch. "We can't stay here and wait for the next one," May said. She'd come up beside them while he wasn't listening for her footsteps. He'd been distracted by the dying barn. She was looking at the same coals he was. "We need to get the ledger to Corbett ourselves, not through intermediaries." "Denver is 2 days' ride," Gideon said. "I know. And Voss will have men on the roads." "I know that too." She turned to look at him. Her face was lit orange from the coals, and there was a cut on her forehead he hadn't noticed before, small, already clotting, from something during the fight that she hadn't mentioned. "Which is why you need to go now, tonight, before they can regroup." He looked at her. "You're not coming. Someone has to stay with Finn and Rose." She said it without any self-sacrifice in her voice, just logistics. "And 2 people moving fast attract less attention than a woman and 2 children. I'm not leaving you here with 5 men tied up in the yard and Voss knowing where you are. Silas will be here," she said, "and Hargrove and Cord and Petrie, and me." She met his eyes directly. "Gideon, the ledger has to reach Corbett. That's the only way any of this ends. You riding to Denver is the only move that Voss can't counter with men and money and lawyers." He knew she was right. He'd been knowing it for the past hour, in the way you know a thing before you're ready to say it. If Voss sends more people, then we deal with it. She said it with a firmness that was not bravado. It was the voice of a woman who had already dealt with more than she should have had to and was still standing. "I know this property now. I know the approaches, I know the sight lines, I know how the hands work. We held them tonight." She paused. "We can hold them again long enough for you to get back." He looked at her for a long time. The fire was dying down to coals and the cold was coming back in to replace the warmth of it. The yard was quiet in the particular way that comes after violence. Not peaceful, just empty, as if the space needed time to settle back into being ordinary. "Take the oilskin copy," she said. "Leave the original ledger here. If they stop you on the road, you have documentation. If they come here, we have more. You keep the original close," he said. "On you. Always?" She said it the same way she'd said it the first time. Then, more quietly, "Go, while it's dark." He went inside and packed what he needed. When he came back out, Silas had his horse saddled. Not the gray, who was still unsettled in the north pasture from the fire, but the roan, steady and fast. Finn was standing in the yard. The boy had no business being out at this hour, but Gideon didn't send him in. He put his hand briefly on Finn's shoulder as he passed. "You know your job," he said. Finn nodded. "You know yours," he said. 12 years old and already talking like a man who understood that accountability ran both directions. Gideon looked at May. She was standing at the porch steps with her arms crossed against the cold, the satchel strap on her shoulder, the coals of his barn glowing orange behind her. "Be careful," he said, which was inadequate and was all he had. "Go," she said. He went. He rode through what remained of the night with the oilskin packet in his inside coat pocket, and the cold pressing at every gap in his clothing and the roan moving well beneath him. And he thought about what he was riding away from as much as what he was riding toward. He thought about 5 men in the yard who'd come to burn his ranch and take a document and had not accounted for the woman who'd counted muzzle flashes and positioned herself at the kitchen window and made a shot in near darkness that had almost certainly saved his life. He thought about a boy who'd said, "You know yours," as if it was obvious, as if the natural order of things involved 12-year-olds issuing quiet expectations to grown men. He thought about a 4-year-old asking where Albert was before the smoke had even finished rising, because the world was frightening and the horse being safe was a thing she could hold on to. He rode east to find the main road and then turned south toward Denver, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the roan's breath made clouds in the dark, and he pushed the pace because the woman he'd told the scouts was his wife was back there holding what was left of his ranch together, and she would do it with or without him, and he understood that completely. And it was possibly the most terrifying and clarifying thing he had understood in 3 years. He did not stop until dawn. He reached Denver on the second afternoon, road-worn and short on sleep, the roan blowing hard on the long grade into the city. Denver in November was a different animal from the high country he'd left. Mud streets, coal smoke, the particular noise of a place that had grown faster than it had planned to and was still figuring out its own edges. He'd been here twice in the past 3 years, both times for ranch business. Both times he'd gotten what he came for and left the same day. He had no affection for cities. He found them exhausting in the specific way that came from too many people making too much noise about things that didn't matter. He found the federal land office on Larimer Street after asking twice. It was a narrow building wedged between a surveying firm and a freight company, with a painted board above the door that was weathering badly at the corners. Inside it was warmer than outside, and smelled of paper and coal and the particular staleness of a room where people spent long hours doing methodical work. A young clerk at the front desk looked up at him with the expression of someone who dealt with aggrieved ranchers regularly and had developed a professional patience for it. "I need to speak with the agent named Corbett," Gideon said. "Mr. Corbett is—" "Tell him Gideon Hale is here from Blue Mesa. Tell him I have documentation on Voss and Meridian." He set his hands on the clerk's desk. He was aware he looked like what he was, a man who'd ridden 2 days without adequate sleep, with a scrape on his jaw and a coat that was torn at the shoulder. "Tell him that, please, and then come back and tell me what he says." The clerk went. He came back in less than 2 minutes, which told Gideon everything he needed to know about whether Corbett had been waiting for this. Marcus Corbett was not what Gideon had expected, which was probably unfair since he hadn't thought carefully about what he'd expected. The man was somewhere in his mid-50s, compact and precise, in the way of someone who had spent decades making careful distinctions between what a document said and what it meant. He wore his jacket like a man who had put it on that morning with the intention of keeping it on all day, regardless of what happened. He had gray eyes and the habit of listening with his whole face rather than just his ears. He shook Gideon's hand and showed him to a chair in an office that had more files stacked in it than any space that size had a right to hold. And he poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether Gideon wanted one, which Gideon appreciated. "You're the man who's been sheltering the Carter woman," Corbett said. He said it as a statement, not an accusation. "She sheltered herself," Gideon said. "My barn was available." Something in Corbett's expression shifted, not quite a smile. "Denise Greer's letter arrived 4 days ago. The first one, the second one 2 days after. I've had people looking at the Voss holding companies for 2 years, Mr. Hale. What you've described, the ledger, the documentation, the scope of it, if it's what it sounds like, it's the piece that closes the case." Gideon reached into his inside coat pocket and put the oilskin packet on the desk. Corbett looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it with careful hands, unfolded the pages, and read in silence. He read slowly. Gideon drank his coffee and let him, because this was the part that required patience, and he had spent 2 days on horseback preparing himself for the part that required patience. After perhaps 20 minutes, Corbett set the pages down flat and aligned their edges with a precision that appeared to be habitual. "This is a partial copy," he said. "The original ledger is at my ranch. I can have it here within the week. I'll need the original for the federal proceeding." Corbett looked at him. "The woman, May Carter, she's prepared to testify?" She told me so. She meant it. There'll be lawyers. Voss has 3 that I know of, and at least 1 judge in this territory who owes him a conversation. Corbett said it flatly, without drama, just the landscape as it was. It won't be fast and it won't be comfortable. She's aware of that. Corbett nodded slowly. He looked at the pages again. Your ranch is in Colbert County. Yes. Voss has a filing already, in Colbert County District Court. He watched Gideon's face when he said it. Filed 9 days ago, a claim of prior survey rights based on a disputed boundary from 1871. His legal people are fast. 9 days ago. That was before the attack on the ranch. Voss had moved on both fronts simultaneously. The legal claim and the armed riders, pressure from 2 directions at once, the same layered approach May had described in the ledger. Gideon felt the cold efficiency of it and made himself not react to it. What does that mean for the ranch? He said. It means that even after we arrest him, and we will arrest him, Mr. Hale, this documentation makes that inevitable. His legal filing stays alive unless someone actively dismantles it. Courts don't dismiss claims just because the claimant is in federal custody. Corbett folded his hands on the desk. You'll need to fight that separately, on the county level, with documentation of your own. What kind of documentation? Title history, certs, survey records going back as far as you have them. Anything that shows uninterrupted ownership and establishes that the 1871 boundary Voss is claiming was never contested in your chain of title. Corbett paused. And witnesses. Neighboring landowners who can testify to the established boundaries. Merchants who've recorded transactions with your operation. Anyone who's dealt with you as the recognized owner of Blue Mesa for long enough that a judge can't dismiss it. Gideon thought about what that meant in practical terms. He thought about the paperwork he had. He was careful with records, had been his whole life, a habit his father had drilled into him, and about what he'd need to find and verify and organize into something that could stand up in a county courtroom. He thought about the neighbors who'd watched him run this ranch for 15 years and what it would take to get them into that courtroom beside him. Can you hold Voss on federal charges while the county case runs? He asked. Once we have the original ledger? Yes. His lawyers will push for bail, but with the scope of what's in that documentation, I can argue flight risk. Corbett's voice had an edge of something that was close to satisfaction, the restrained kind that belongs to a person who has been building towards something for a long time. We'll move within the week of receiving the original. I'll need you to bring it personally. The chain of custody matters. I'll be back in 5 days, Gideon said. 4 would be better. He stood. He was stiff from the ride, and the chair had not helped. There's one more thing, he said. The men from the raid on my ranch, 5 of them, tied up in my yard when I left. 2 more that my foreman took off their horses on the east fence. Corbett was already reaching for paper. Tell me everything you remember. Walk to. He rode back harder than he'd ridden down, pushing the roan on the open flats and holding back only on the grade where footing was uncertain. He'd slept one night in Denver, in a boarding house room that smelled of pipe smoke and old wool, and he'd slept badly because he was thinking about what he'd left behind and how many days had passed since he'd left it. Corbett had said he'd send a wire ahead to the county marshal in Millhaven to collect the men from the ranch, which would relieve some pressure. But the legal filing in district court was a different matter, and that was going to require work of a different kind. He was thinking about that work on the second day of riding back, working through it in pieces the way he worked through anything complicated when he crested the ridge above the Blue Mesa Valley and looked down at his property and stopped the roan. The barn was a ruin. He'd known that. He'd watched it burn. But seeing the footprint of it in daylight from this distance, the black outline, the remaining walls standing jagged and roofless, the absence of the shape that had been part of his skyline for 15 years, settled into him in a way the burning itself hadn't. He sat on the ridge for a moment and let himself feel it, because he'd learned the hard way that the things you didn't feel eventually found other ways out. Then he rode down. May was in the yard when he came through the gate, which probably meant someone on watch had spotted him coming down the ridge. She was wearing work clothes, a canvas jacket he didn't recognize, probably something of Silas's, and her hair was back and she had the particular alert stillness of someone who had been managing a situation for multiple days and had gotten good at it. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him on the porch that first night when he'd told her they could stay, like she was taking a measurement, You got there, she said. I got there. Corbett. He's moving. He needs the original ledger, and he needs it in 4 days. I told him 5. He got down from the roan. His knees registered their opinion of 2 days hard riding. Tell me what happened while I was gone. Marshall's men came yesterday, she said. Collected the 5 from the yard. The 2 from the fence line Silas had already handed to a deputy who came through the first night. She watched him hand the roan to Petrie, who'd appeared from the direction of the remuda. Silas's side is healing. Cord's arm is fine. We patched the kitchen window with board until we can get glass. And Voss, she was quiet for a moment. A man came 2 days after you left, not a rider, a lawyer. He served papers. She crossed her arms. District court filing. Prior survey claim on the eastern boundary. Corbett told me about it. It was filed before the raid. I know. I read the papers carefully. Her jaw was set. The claim cites an 1871 boundary survey that supposedly places the eastern quarter of Blue Mesa inside a prior land grant that Voss's holding company now owns by purchase. She paused. The survey document they cite, I'd want to see it because I'm willing to bet it's been altered or it's fabricated entirely, but I don't have access to the county records. We're going to need to get access, he said. Corbett wants us to build a parallel case in county court, establish the title history, find witnesses, counter the survey claim with documentation. He looked at her. That's your department more than mine. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me to do what my father did. Yes, he said. I'm asking you to do what your father did. And I think you know how to do it. Something in her face moved through several expressions in quick succession, too fast to name them all. Then it settled. I'm going to need access to the county records office, she said. And I'm going to need someone to vouch for me when I get there, because I'm not on any record as being associated with this property, and they'll want to know who I am. I'll go with you, he said. That's not what I mean. She looked at him with the particular directness she used when she was saying something she'd thought about carefully. They'll need to know my standing, my relationship to this property. On paper, I'm a woman who arrived in a blizzard with 2 children and has been here 6 weeks. He understood what she was saying. He'd been waiting for it in some way without knowing exactly when it would arrive. What do you want to do? He asked. She held his gaze for a moment. That's actually the question, isn't it? She said it not as a complaint, as an observation about the strangeness of the situation they were in. 2 people who'd arrived at the edge of something without having walked the ordinary path to get there. I told the scouts you were my wife, he said. I know. It wasn't only for cover. He said it plainly, the way she always said things plainly, because it seemed like the only right approach with her. I want you to know that. She looked at him for what felt like a long time. The yard was quiet. Behind her, he could see the ruin of the barn, and past it the cottonwood trees on the hill, bare and gray in the November light. The children need stability, she said, not as an evasion, as a thing that was true and had to be named first. I know, and I'm not easy, she said. I don't accommodate well. I have opinions and I state them. I get set in the way I do things. I've noticed, he said. She looked at him with something that might have been, very briefly, amusement. Then it steadied back. I'm not marrying you to solve a legal problem, she said. I want that stated clearly before anything else. It's stated. And I'm not performing gratitude. You've kept us safe and I'm grateful, but that's not... May, he said. She stopped. I know, he said. None of that is what I'm asking. She let out a breath. It wasn't quite relief. It was more like the release of a tension that had been held so long she'd stopped noticing it. Then yes, she said, if you're asking. He was asking. She looked down for a moment, then back up. We should probably not tell Rose until after, she said. She'll want to plan something. He almost laughed. He got closer to it than he had in a long time. Bummed. They were married in Millhaven 4 days later in the office of the Justice of the Peace, with Silas and the clerk as witnesses. It was brief and functional and not romantic in any conventional sense. Silas had brought wildflowers from somewhere, which he presented to May with a formality that suggested he'd thought about it. And Rose, who had been told only at the last moment, spent the ceremony standing between them and holding a hand of each, which was not what any of them had planned, but which turned out to be exactly right. Finn shook Gideon's hand afterward. That was all. But he held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and Gideon understood what was in it. The marriage certificate went on record that afternoon. May Hale, née Carter, lawful wife of Gideon Hale, Blue Mesa Ranch, Colbert County. She looked at the paper when the clerk slid it across the desk, and she looked at it the way she looked at documents generally, carefully, thoroughly, reading every word. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. All right, she said. Now, let's go look at those county records. The county records office was in the same building as the district court, staffed by a man named Olin Pratt, who was somewhere past 60 and had the demeanor of someone who had watched various dramas play out across his counter for several decades and had developed a careful neutrality toward all of them. He looked at May's request, and then at her, and then at Gideon standing beside her, and said he'd need to know the specific records she was looking for. She told him, survey records from 1868 through 1875, title transfer documents for the eastern boundary parcels of what was now Blue Mesa Ranch. Any recorded disputes or contested claims in that period for the same area. She said it with the assurance of someone who understood the filing system before she'd set foot in the room, which appeared to make an impression on Pratt because he asked her if she'd worked in a records office. My father did, she said. For 12 years. He pulled the records. It took time. May sat at the reading table with her coat on because the records office was not warm and went through the documents one by one with a methodical attention that would have made her father recognize her. Gideon sat across from her, and she passed him documents to review as she finished with them, building a picture together. The 1871 boundary survey that Voss's lawyers had cited existed. Gideon had been afraid for a moment that it wouldn't, that it would turn out to be entirely fabricated and they'd have nothing to compare it against. But it was there in the files, and that was both better and worse. Better because a real document could be examined and challenged. Worse because a real document had been worked with, and worked with documents were harder to dismiss than pure fabrications. May found the problem in the third hour. She set the survey document beside Gideon's original 1868 survey. He'd brought it from the ranch, folded in the oilskin with the ledger copy, and she put her finger on a number. This measurement, she said. Her voice was quiet and precise. The eastern boundary stake. In the 1868 survey, it's placed at 1,460 feet from Colbert Creek's east bank. In the 1871 survey Voss is citing, it's 1,406. He looked at both documents. 54 feet. 54 feet in a single boundary measurement, in a survey done 3 years after the original. She looked up at him. Survey equipment doesn't misread the same boundary by 54 feet between surveys without a reason. And the 1871 document, look at the ink on this entry. She held it toward the light from the window. The rest of the document is aged consistently. This measurement and the entry below it is darker. The paper is slightly compressed, like it was written with more pressure, or written later and pressed to make it lie flat. That's not something you can prove by looking at it, Gideon said. He wasn't disagreeing. He was thinking about what a court needed. No, she said, but you can prove it by finding the original 1871 surveyor's field notes and comparing them. She turned the document over. The surveyor's name was printed at the bottom, R.F. Harker, Colbert County licensed surveyor. If Harker kept field notes, and good surveyors always keep field notes, and if those notes survived, they'll have the raw measurements he took before transcribing to the official document. If the field notes show 1,460, and the filed document shows 1,406, we have our alteration. Can you find a surveyor from 1871? I can find his records, she said. A licensed surveyor would have filed copies of his major surveys with the Territorial Land Office in Denver. She was already reaching for another document from the stack. And Corbett's office is in Denver. If we wire ahead to Corbett and ask him to pull Harker's territorial filings, he'll have them before we can ride there, Gideon said. He felt the thing that happened when a plan that was supposed to be difficult started to show its workable shape. It wasn't triumph, it was more like solid ground after uncertain footing. We also need the witnesses Corbett mentioned, May said. She didn't look up from the document. Neighboring ranchers, how many would come? 3 that I'd count on for certain, Gideon said. He thought about it. Possibly 5. There are two more who are more cautious, but if the others commit, they might follow. Can you ask them? I can ride to them. It'd take 2 days for all 5. Then you ride. She set the document down and looked at him. I'll stay here and keep working through the records. I want the full title chain from 1862 to now, every transfer, every recorded transaction. If there are any other discrepancies in Voss's claim documents, I want to find them before his lawyers do. He looked at her sitting at that table in her coat with documents spread around her, perfectly in her element, doing exactly what she was built to do. He thought about what her father had spent 12 years building and had died before seeing used. Your father would be glad, he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out. She was quiet for a moment. She didn't look up from the document in her hands. You'd be telling me the ink dating is still circumstantial and I need corroborating documentation, she said, but her voice had shifted slightly at the edges. Which is why we need Harker's field notes. He stood. I'll wire Corbett before I ride out. Take Silas with you, she said, in case Voss has anyone watching the roads. He'd already intended to. He put on his hat and went. Boot. The next 6 days were the hardest kind of hard, not the dramatic kind, not gunfire and burning barns, but the grinding work of building something out of paper and persuasion and the accumulated weight of other people's memories. Gideon rode to 5 neighboring ranches. He explained what had happened and what was at stake and what he needed. And he did it without making speeches because he didn't have the gift for speeches, and the men he was talking to would have been suspicious of speeches anyway. He said the facts plainly. Voss had moved on Blue Mesa. There was documentation to fight it in court, and he needed people who dealt with him as their neighbor for 15 years to say so in front of a judge. The first rancher, a man named Caulfield who ran cattle on the south side of the ridge, said yes before Gideon finished the explanation. I've been waiting for someone to do something about Voss for 3 years, Caulfield said. He was 60 years old and had a particular grimness that suggested this was not the first thing in his life he'd waited 3 years for. What do you need me to say, and when? The second and third said yes with more questions, which Gideon answered. The fourth asked for time to talk to his wife, which Gideon respected. The wife turned out to have sharper opinions about Voss than her husband did, and he came back inside in 20 minutes to say they'd both come. The fifth, a rancher named Beaumont, who'd lost a section of land to a Voss subsidiary 2 years ago and had never been able to prove it, sat across from Gideon at his kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. He has lawyers, Beaumont said. So does Corbett. Federal case is one thing. County court is where Voss is comfortable. He looked at his coffee cup. I have a family, Gideon. I know. I'm not saying no. He said it carefully. I'm saying I need to know this isn't going to blow back on me when the federal case closes and the county thing drags on for 2 years. I can't promise you how long it drags, Gideon said. I can tell you that May has been through the county records and she's found what we think is an altered document in Voss's survey claim. If that holds up, his county case collapses independent of the federal charges. He looked at Beaumont straight. I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to say in a courtroom what you already know is true. Beaumont was quiet for another moment. Then he said, That woman, May, your wife. Yes, Silas told me she shot a man off your porch in the dark. Through a window, Gideon said. Yes. Beaumont looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to categorize. Then he nodded. All right, he said. I'll come. May had found 3 additional discrepancies in the county records by the time Gideon got back. 2 were in the transfer documents for properties adjacent to Blue Mesa. Measurements that didn't match between original surveys and later filings, the same signature pattern as the altered boundary document. The third was more significant. A deed of sale for a parcel that Voss claimed his holding company had purchased in 1873 bore a notary stamp that, according to Pratt's own records, hadn't been issued to that notary until 1875. He's been doing this for years, May said, the night Gideon came back. She said it without surprise. She'd known it from the ledger, but seeing it laid out in the county's own records gave it a different texture. He's so confident in his control of the local system that he didn't even bother to be consistent. Pratt, Gideon said, the records clerk. He showed you all of this without pushback. He's careful, she said. He doesn't take sides openly, but I think he's been watching Voss's filings for years and not had anyone capable of doing anything about them. She paused. He may be a witness too. I didn't ask him yet. Don't push him too fast. I know how to read people, she said mildly. He acknowledged this without comment because it was simply true. Corbett's wire arrived the next morning. Harker's territorial field notes had been located in the Denver Land Office archive, filed in 1871 as required by law and untouched since. The field measurement for the Blue Mesa eastern boundary stake, 1,460 feet from Colbert Creek's east bank, identical to the 1868 survey. 54 feet different from the filed county document that Voss's lawyers were citing. May read the wire twice. She set it flat on the kitchen table and looked at it. That's it, she said. That's it, he agreed. She let out a breath. It was a short breath, controlled, but something in it had been held for a long time. She didn't celebrate. She put the wire in the folder with the other documents and looked at what else needed doing. We need to publish, she said. He looked at her. Publish. The altered survey, the notary stamp discrepancy, the full picture of what Voss has been doing in this county and the 3 others from the ledger. She looked back at him steadily. Corbett's federal case runs through courts that Voss's lawyers know how to slow down. A county judge can find reasons to delay a hearing for months. But there's one thing that's harder to contain than a court case. Public knowledge, he said. If the territory's newspapers have the story, not rumors, actual documentation, actual facts with dates and names, then every official who tries to rule in Voss's favor is doing it in front of everyone who read about it that morning. She paused. My father couldn't go public. He was one man with a ledger and no protection. We're different. We have Corbett's case in motion, 5 neighbors willing to testify, a set of discrepancies that hold up in their own county's records, and a federal arrest coming that will make Voss's name familiar to every reader in the territory. Which newspaper? The Territorial Clarion runs in 3 counties, she said. Their editor is a man named Vance. Silas knows him. She looked at Gideon. I want to go talk to him. He looked at her for a moment. He was thinking about everything that could go wrong with going to a newspaper. The lawyers Voss would send, the injunctions, the ways that Voss's influence could reach into a small newspaper's operations. He was also thinking about the barn ruin visible from the kitchen window and the altered number in the county survey document, and the family of a rancher named Pickens, who'd stood and watched their house burn. We go together, he said. She nodded. Tomorrow morning. She turned back to her documents. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside, and somewhere in the house, Rose's voice doing something that involved a long narration, probably to Finn, probably about Albert or the cloth rabbit, or some combination of both. Gideon sat down across from May and looked at the folder of documents she'd assembled over the past week. The title chain for Blue Mesa going back to 1862. The survey comparisons with Corbett's wire attached. 3 witness statements she'd already had Gideon's neighbors write out and sign. So their words were on paper regardless of what happened before the hearing. The notary stamp discrepancy with Pratt's own records cross-referenced. Copies of the ledger sections most relevant to the county case. His wife had spent 6 days building a legal argument in a records office while managing 2 children and a household and a ranch that was still functioning, barely, without a barn. He thought about what it would have been to go through the last 3 years differently. Not without Elena. He couldn't think in those terms, didn't want to, but differently in the sense of not being alone in the specific way he'd been alone. Not the loneliness of an empty house, though there was that too. The loneliness of having no one to be accountable to. No one whose assessment of a decision mattered enough to slow you down. He hadn't realized how much of himself he'd been managing alone until there was someone else in the room. I need to go check on the cattle before dark, he said. May didn't look up. Silas already did. I know, he said. I want to go anyway. She looked up at that with the brief expression of someone who understood what wasn't being said. All right, she said, and went back to her documents. He went out. He walked up the hill past the cottonwood trees to the 2 graves, the way he did every Sunday, and stood there in the cold with his hat in his hands. He hadn't been up since before the raid. The ground was frozen and the trees were bare, and the valley below was lit in the long, low light of late November. He didn't talk this time either. He just stood there for a while and let himself be in the place that had been the geography of his worst 3 years, and was also the place he'd lived his best ones. Both things were true. That was the thing about places. He put his hat back on and walked down. Vance, the editor of the Territorial Clarion, was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the particular restless energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for a story worth printing. He met them in his office above the print shop, which smelled of solvent and paper and the specific warmth of machinery that ran continuously. And he listened to May lay out the case with an attention that got sharper with every document she placed on his desk. He asked good questions. Not the questions of a man looking for sensation, the burned barn, the gunfight, the dramatic elements that would sell papers, but the questions of someone who understood that a story built on bad evidence collapsed and took its publisher with it. He wanted to know how the survey discrepancy had been established, whether the field notes were in a verifiable archive, whether the notary stamp issue could be confirmed independently of May's own analysis. May answered every question with a document or a reference to one. By the end of the second hour, Vance had read the wire from Corbett, cross-referenced 2 of the county records himself against his own copies from a previous story he'd tried and failed to publish about a neighboring land dispute, and was sitting back in his chair with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. "The federal case," he said. "Corbett is moving when?" "Within the week," Gideon said. "He has the original ledger. He has enough." "Then I run this when the arrest is made," Vance said. "Not before. Before, it's allegation. After, it's fact with context." He looked at May. "But I want a full account written before then. In your words, not mine. What your father built. What happened to him. What you've been through since. Not for sympathy. For the record." He paused. "The survey fraud, the county case, the federal charges, those are facts. The human account of how the documentation survived is what makes people understand why it matters." May was quiet for a moment. "You want me to write it?" "I want you to tell it to my reporter and let him write it with you approving every word," Vance said. "I've learned not to paraphrase women who know more than I do. It goes badly." Gideon watched May consider this. He could see her weighing the exposure, the specific vulnerability of having her father's death and her family's circumstances laid out in print for the territory to read, against the argument she'd made herself about public knowledge being the thing that officials couldn't ignore. "All right," she said, "but I want it accurate, not dramatic. The facts are dramatic enough on their own." Vance almost smiled. "That's what every good subject says," he told her. "And they're always right." Cassian Voss was arrested on a Thursday morning in the first week of December at his offices in Pueblo. Corbett's people moved on him simultaneously with federal marshals visiting 2 of his holding company offices in neighboring territories, a coordination that had apparently taken weeks to arrange and that Voss's lawyers had not anticipated. The arrest warrant cited 47 specific counts across 4 territories: land fraud, document falsification, bribery of public officials, and in Harlan County, 1 count of accessory to the suspicious death of a county records keeper named Arthur Carter. Gideon learned about the arrest from a wire that arrived at the Millhaven Telegraph office on a Friday, delivered by Denise Greer's nephew, who rode out to the ranch personally because, as he explained with a 15-year-old sense of occasion, he figured they'd want to know as soon as possible. May read the wire at the kitchen table. Finn was across from her. Rose was somewhere in the back of the house with Silas, who had been recruited into some project involving string and the gray horse that Gideon had chosen not to investigate too closely. May read it once, then set it flat on the table, then read it again. She didn't cry. Gideon had half expected that she might, and he'd prepared himself to be useful in that event. But she didn't. She sat very still for a moment with her hand on the wire, and then she said quietly, to no one in particular, "He got it documented, Papa." Finn looked at her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers on the table and left it there. Gideon found something to do at the stove. He made coffee that nobody needed and poured 3 cups and set them down. And when he turned around, May was composed again, the composure of someone who has felt something fully and put it where it belongs. "The county hearing," she said. "Vance will run the story in Monday's edition," Gideon said. "We requested the county hearing date 2 days ago. Judge Harmon's clerk said 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. That's enough time. It was enough time for what she'd been building, the title chain, the survey comparison, the witness statements, the notary discrepancy. She'd organized it into a document that Gideon had read twice, and that was either the most thorough piece of legal argument ever assembled by a woman who wasn't a lawyer or was exactly what it looked like, which was her father's daughter doing her father's work. "Beaumont?" Gideon said. "I want to check in with him before the hearing. Make sure he's still committed." "He'll come," she said. She said it with confidence he didn't entirely share but had learned to treat seriously, because her reads on people had been consistently better than his own. "Caulfield for certain," he agreed. "All 5, she said. "And Pratt." He looked at her. "Pratt agreed?" "Yesterday." She allowed herself a small, dry satisfaction. "He's been watching Voss's filings for 6 years. He said it was the notary stamp that finally made him willing to go on record. He's been careful about it because he has to work in that building every day, regardless of how the case comes out." She paused. "I told him we'd make sure the judge understood that his cooperation was essential and that he acted from professional integrity, not partisanship. He appreciated the distinction." She'd told him that without being asked, because she'd understood what Pratt needed before Pratt had said it. Gideon filed this away alongside 100 other similar observations he'd been accumulating over the past weeks. The Territorial Clarion ran the story on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Gideon had received 4 letters from people he didn't know personally. 2 ranching families in neighboring counties who'd lost land to Voss subsidiaries and wanted to know if their situations were relevant to the federal case. 1 woman in Millhaven who said her late husband had refused a survey alteration request from someone he hadn't named at the time, and a retired county commissioner who wrote in a shaking hand that he'd been watching Voss's operations for years and had been afraid to say anything, and was no longer afraid. He brought the letters to May. She read them all the same way she read everything, completely, carefully, twice, and then she sorted them into 2 piles. "These 2 are relevant to Corbett," she said, indicating the ranching families. "He should know about them before the federal proceedings. The woman in Millhaven could be relevant to the Harlan County accessory charge. Specifically, Corbett needs her name." She set the commissioner's letter apart. "And this one?" She looked at it. A county commissioner who was watching and afraid to speak. "That's not evidence of anything except the climate Voss created, but it matters. It's the kind of testimony that puts the pattern in context for a judge." "You think he'd testify?" "He wrote to us," she said. "A man who's afraid to speak doesn't write a letter to the people taking on the man he's afraid of." She looked up. "He needs someone to ask him directly." Gideon wrote back to all 4 that afternoon, May sitting beside him and reading each draft before he sealed it. The county hearing was set for a Wednesday. It snowed the night before, lightly, enough to dust the ruined barn's remaining walls white and soften the outlines of the yard. Gideon woke early and lay in the dark listening to the snow settle and thought about what the day required. What it required was straightforward on paper. Present the documentation, put witnesses on record, let the facts speak clearly enough that a judge couldn't find a way around them. The complication was that Judge Harmon operated in a county where Voss had done business for years, and while the arrest had publicly removed Voss from the board, his lawyers were still very much in play, still filing motions, still looking for leverage. Gideon had no illusions about the hearing being easy. May was already dressed when he came downstairs. She had the folder of documents under her arm and she'd done her hair differently. Not elaborately, just pinned back more carefully than usual. The difference between how a woman looks when she's working the cattle and how she looks when she's decided to make an impression in a formal room. She was wearing the dark jacket she'd bought in Millhaven the week they were married. It was practical and it fit well, and she wore it the way she wore everything, as something functional rather than decorative, but she was aware of the effect she presented. She looked at him once when he came down, a quick assessment, and said, "Your good coat." He went back upstairs and put on the good coat. Finn and Rose stayed at the ranch with Hargrove. Rose had opinions about this arrangement, which she expressed fully and then accepted because she had learned that certain adult decisions were not subject to revision regardless of how clearly one stated one's position. Finn said nothing when they left, just stood on the porch and watched them ride out, and then went back inside. And Gideon knew the boy would spend the morning doing something useful, because that was how Finn processed waiting. They rode to Millhaven with Silas and the 5 neighboring ranchers, and the retired county commissioner, who had turned out to be a compact man of 70, named Selden, who had driven his own wagon from 12 miles out and arrived at the ranch at dawn because he wanted to be sure he wasn't late. He'd shaken May's hand with both of his, and said he was sorry it had taken him this long to be useful. "You're useful now," she'd told him. "That's what matters." The Colbert County Courthouse was a two-story building of pale brick that always looked slightly surprised by its own existence in the middle of the high country landscape. The main room was not large, 12 rows of benches, a raised bench for the judge, tables for each side, a gallery that by 9 in the morning was filling with people who'd read the Clarion story and made the ride to town to see what happened next. Gideon recognized faces from neighboring ranches, from the Millhaven Merchant District, from the feed store where he'd done business for 15 years. He recognized Denise Greer from the telegraph office, sitting in the third row with the stillness of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for a considerable time. Voss's lawyers were two of them, both from Denver, both wearing suits that said they charged more per hour than most men in the room made in a month. They had the polished, unhurried manner of people who operated in rooms like this regularly and had never had cause to feel threatened by a rancher and a woman with a folder of documents. Judge Harmon was 63, gray-haired, with a face that had been carefully arranged over many years into an expression of total judicial neutrality. Gideon had appeared before him twice in 15 years, a boundary dispute with a neighbor in 1879, a water rights question in 1881, and had found him to be fair in the specific way that meant he followed the documentation wherever it led, regardless of who'd brought it. He wasn't warm, he wasn't sympathetic, but he was, in Gideon's experience, honest. Gideon did not have a lawyer. He'd considered it, asked around, found that the two men in Millhaven who handled property law were both already retained by parties connected to Voss's operations, which told him something about how thoroughly Voss had prepared for legal opposition. He decided to present the case himself, with May beside him, which was irregular but not prohibited, and when the lead attorney for Voss's holding company had objected in a pre-hearing motion, Judge Harmon had noted that a property owner was within his rights to present his own title documentation and had moved on. May presented the case. It wasn't what they'd formally agreed on. They'd planned for Gideon to lead and May to handle the documents. But when the hearing opened and Judge Harmon asked the plaintiff to state his position, Gideon had looked at her and she'd looked at him, and he'd nodded, because it was obvious who should be speaking. She stood. She was not a lawyer, and she did not pretend to be one. She was a woman who had spent 6 weeks organizing every piece of documentation relevant to Blue Mesa's title history into a logical structure, and she presented it that way, clearly, in sequence, with each document named and offered to the court before she drew conclusions from it. She started with the 1862 original survey and deed. She walked through each transfer and confirmation of title, noting the dates and parties, building the chain link by link until 1881. She presented Gideon's 15 years of property tax payments as recorded in the county's own records. Pratt, in the gallery, sat with his hands folded and the expression of a man prepared to confirm every page if asked. Then she got to the 1871 survey document that Voss's filing cited. She placed it on the judge's bench. She placed beside it the 1868 original survey. She placed beside that the wire from Corbett's office confirming the contents of R.F. Harker's territorial field notes. The boundary measurement in the document the opposing filing relies on differs from both the original 1868 survey and the licensed surveyor's own field notes by exactly 54 feet, she said. The same measurement in the same location on a boundary that has no natural features that could account for a change in 3 years. She paused. I would ask the court to compare the ink density and paper impression on that specific entry against the rest of the 1871 document. Harmon looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time, tilting it toward the window light the way May had done in the records office. His expression didn't change, but something in his attention sharpened. Voss's lead attorney rose. He was smooth. He said the field notes couldn't be authenticated without the surveyor present, that variations in measurement were common in frontier surveys, that the plaintiff was making inferences from documents that required expert analysis to interpret. May had expected this. She'd written down the objections she expected and her responses to them, and she'd read them to Gideon 3 nights ago while he listened and told her which ones sounded solid and which ones needed more. The field notes are archived in the Territorial Land Office in Denver, under a file number I can provide, she said. They were filed in 1871 as required by territorial law and have been untouched since. Their authenticity can be confirmed by any authorized officer of the court. She paused. As for expert analysis, The County Commissioner of Records, Olin Pratt, has held his position for 11 years and is present in this courtroom. He reviewed both documents at the records office in his professional capacity. I would ask the court to hear his testimony. Bishamant. Harmon looked at the gallery. Mr. Pratt, he said, come forward. Pratt came forward. He was careful, measured, precise in the way of a man who understood that every word he said in this room would be on record. He described both documents and what he'd observed about the ink and paper impression in the same language he'd used to May in the records office: professional, technical, specific. He said he had observed similar patterns in 3 other documents filed by Voss, holding company subsidiaries over the past 6 years, and had noted them in his own internal records without acting because he had not been certain of the legal avenue available to him. The gallery was quiet in a way that wasn't emptiness, but attention. After Pratt, the 5 ranchers testified in turn. What they said was simple and consistent. They had dealt with Gideon Hale as the recognized owner of Blue Mesa for between 8 and 15 years. They had shared boundary fences with him, conducted cattle trades with him, resolved water schedule disputes with him according to boundaries that had never been contested until now. The eastern boundary of Blue Mesa had been where it was in the 1868 survey for as long as any of them could remember. Beaumont testified last. He was the most reluctant of the 5 and also, it turned out, the most effective, precisely because his reluctance was visible. A man who clearly would have preferred to be somewhere else, who measured every word, and who stated clearly that in 1880 a representative of Voss and Meridian Land Partners had approached him with an offer to sign an affidavit regarding a boundary dispute with a neighboring property that was, in his professional judgment, as a man who'd worked cattle in Colbert County for 20 years, factually incorrect. He had declined. The representative had suggested that declining would be remembered. The gallery reacted to that. Not noisily. These were not people who made noise in courtrooms, but the quality of the silence changed. Voss's attorneys cross-examined. They were competent, and they worked hard, and they found genuine ambiguities in 2 of the documents and pressed them effectively. The hearing ran past noon and into the afternoon, and there were moments when Harmon asked questions that suggested he was looking for a reason to delay, a request for additional expert review, a continuation pending authentication of the field notes, and each time, May had an answer that foreclosed the delay without being aggressive about it. She knew when to be direct and when to let the question answer itself. She had been preparing for this for 6 weeks and, in a different sense, for her entire life. Selden, the retired commissioner, testified for 20 minutes in the late afternoon. He did not have documents. He had memory and professional history and the specific credibility of an old man with nothing left to protect who had decided to stop being quiet. He described what Voss's operation had looked like from the inside of county government, the careful pressure, the implied consequences, the way information moved from officials to Voss's people before it should have. He named no one still in public office. He named 3 people who were no longer in public office and explained why they were no longer there. The gallery was not quiet after Selden. It was the specific noise of people who have heard something confirmed that they had suspected but not been able to name. Judge Harmon called a recess. He was gone for 40 minutes. Gideon and May sat at the plaintiff's table and did not talk much. She reorganized the documents into their folder in the order she'd presented them, which was what she did when she was managing something internal. He looked at the bench and the window behind it and the square of December light coming through it and thought about nothing in particular. Silas in the gallery was doing what Silas did, sitting straight and still with his hands on his knees, the posture of a man who has waited out many things and knows that waiting requires its own kind of discipline. When Harmon came back, he settled himself at the bench and looked at both tables with the face he'd maintained all day. The plaintiff has presented a documented title chain that establishes continuous and uncontested ownership of Blue Mesa Ranch from 1862 through the present, he said. His voice was flat and even, the voice of a man reading a determination he's already made. The survey document cited in the opposing filing differs from the licensed surveyor's own field notes in a specific boundary measurement, a discrepancy the court finds material and not explained by the normal variation of frontier survey practice. He paused. The court finds the 1871 boundary survey as filed to be unreliable as a basis for the present claim. The opposing filing is dismissed. He said 2 more sentences about costs and filing dates that Gideon absorbed without fully processing. Then it was done. Voss's attorneys were already reaching for their papers, already calculating the next motion, the appeal, the alternative legal avenue. Because men like that didn't stop. They just changed instruments. Gideon knew there would be more. He'd accepted that before he walked into the room. But the ranch was his. On record, in judgment, in the county's own documentation. Whatever came next would have to start from that. He looked at May. She was sitting with both hands flat on the folder, looking at the bench. Her face was composed in that particular way it got when she was holding something that she wasn't going to let out in a public room. He put his hand over hers on the folder. She turned hers over and held it, briefly, with the grip of someone who needed an anchor and was not accustomed to admitting it. Then she let go and stood up and gathered the documents and said, "We should wire Corbett." "Yes," he said. "We should." Cassian Voss was tried in federal court the following March. The trial ran 11 days and produced more coverage in the territorial papers than anything since the railroad disputes of the previous decade. May testified on the fourth day. She was on the stand for 3 hours. She was precise, she was thorough, and at one point one of Voss's attorneys asked her a question intended to suggest that a woman with no legal training had no basis for interpreting the documents in her father's ledger. And she answered it with such careful, complete accuracy about the specific legal frameworks her father had used that the attorney did not ask another question in that direction. Gideon sat in the gallery for her testimony. He watched the jury watching her. 12 men, various ages, various backgrounds, none of them accustomed to a woman standing in a federal courtroom and taking apart a land fraud operation piece by piece. And he watched them stop performing attention and start actually paying it, which was a different thing and took about 20 minutes to happen. Voss received 19 years on the primary federal counts. Additional sentencing in 2 other territories added 12 more. His holding companies were ordered dissolved, their assets frozen, pending claims from the families who'd lost property through his operations. A process that would take years and would not make any of those families whole, because that was the truth about justice. It was better than nothing and less than enough. The 9 ranches documented in the ledger were the subject of a separate federal review. 3 families had already scattered too far to reconstitute their claims. 4 others received partial restitution from the frozen assets. 2 received enough to rebuild, though what they rebuilt would not be what they'd had, because you can restore a deed, but you can't restore the years. Arthur Carter's death was ruled a homicide. The man directly responsible had died in Voss's employ before the arrest. The charge of accessory stood against Voss, and was one of the counts that added to his federal sentence. It was not, as May had known it would not be, satisfying in the way that closure is described as satisfying. It was the law doing what the law could do, which was assign consequence. It didn't give her father back. It didn't unsay the lie about the stairs. But it put it on record, and the record was what her father had believed in, and she believed in it too, even knowing its limits. She told Gideon this on the ride back from Denver after the sentencing, and he listened without filling the silence with anything, which was what she needed. He would have wanted to see the hearing, she said, the county hearing specifically, Harker's field notes. She looked at the road ahead. He would have been furious about the 54 feet. He would have said any surveyor who let a discrepancy like that stand in his filed records wasn't worth his license. He would have been right, Gideon said. She smiled at that. A real one, not the almost. Yen. Spring came the way it always did in the high country. Grudgingly at first, then all at once, as if the land had been holding its breath and finally decided to release it. The ruins of the barn came down in March. The charred walls dismantled by Gideon and his hands over a week of cold mornings, the salvageable lumber set aside. By April, the foundation had been relaid. By May, the new frame was up, taller than the old one, with a loft that had proper ventilation and a north-facing door that Silas had wanted for 20 years, and that Gideon had finally built the way Silas wanted, because Silas had been right about it all along, and it seemed worth acknowledging. Finn turned 13 in April. He'd grown 2 inches since November and had taken on, without negotiation, the role of third ranch hand in all but name. He worked alongside Hargrove in the mornings and had started learning the accounting books in the evenings. Not because anyone had suggested it, but because May had left them on the kitchen table one night, and he'd picked one up and asked how the columns worked. She'd sat with him for an hour explaining it. He'd come back the next night with questions, and the next, and by the third week it was simply a thing they did. Finn at the table with the books, and May reading or writing nearby, occasionally answering a question or asking one back. Gideon watched this without commenting on it. He wasn't sure what he would have said if he had. There was something in it that was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. Rose remained herself, which was to say she remained a person of strong opinions, reliable warmth, and the specific relentlessness of a child who has decided that the world is interesting and intends to investigate all of it. She had fully claimed Albert, not as a pet, she understood he was a working horse, but as a personal relationship conducted on her own terms. Albert tolerated this with a philosophy that Gideon found impressive in a large animal. She stopped humming Elena's lullaby sometime in the early spring. Gideon noticed its absence the way you notice a sound that's been present so long it had become background, and its stopping was a kind of presence too. He didn't know where Finn had learned it, whether he'd heard it somewhere, or whether music sometimes traveled in ways that didn't require explanation. He never asked. It seemed like the kind of thing that was better left as what it was, a strange small fact at the edge of a larger story. He still went to the hill on Sundays. He still stood with his hat in his hands, but the feeling of it had shifted in a way that was hard to name, less like standing at the edge of something and more like standing in the middle of something. The two graves hadn't changed. The cottonwood trees were leafing out now, that particular pale green of spring that looked almost translucent in the right light. He felt no guilt about the shift, which surprised him. He'd expected to feel guilty. He'd thought moving forward would feel like leaving behind. It didn't. It felt like carrying, which was heavier in some ways and lighter in others. He came back down from the hill one Sunday in May and found May at the kitchen table with a letter she'd been reading when he left and apparently hadn't finished. She looked up when he came in. "From Corbett," she said. "The Pickens family, Nevada Territory." He remembered. Obert Pickens, page 47 of the ledger, the man whose house had burned 6 weeks after the court ruled against him. "They filed a claim against Voss's dissolved holding company," May said. "Corbett thinks they have a strong case. They want to know if I'll submit a statement regarding the specific documentation in my father's ledger that relates to their property." "Will you?" She folded the letter. "Yes." She said it the way she said most things, without ceremony, as if it were obvious. "Of course." He got his coffee and sat down. "There'll be more," he said. "Letters, families, people who lost something they can't fully get back." "I know." She set the letter aside and picked up the next one in the stack. There was always a stack now, some ranch business, some correspondence from Corbett's office, some from people who'd read the Clarion story and written without knowing what exactly they were asking for. "I can't fix all of it." "No, but I can do what I can with what I have." She looked up at him. "Which is generally what you do." He'd heard her say that before. She'd said it about her father. He thought about the man who'd kept meticulous records for 12 years and died before seeing them used, and the daughter who'd carried those records across a blizzard and into a stranger's barn and all the way to a federal courtroom. And he thought about what it meant that the same phrase fit both of them. Not because they were the same person, but because some ways of being in the world are built rather than born, handed down through example the way the lullaby had been handed down, quietly and without explanation, persisting past the person who started it. The new barn was 3/4 framed by the end of May. On the Saturday they finished the last wall, Silas produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere that he refused to explain and poured a measure for everyone present, including, after a brief debate with May that Finn appeared to win on points. Finn, who received a very small measure and drank it with the expression of someone discovering that adult celebrations were mostly atmospheric. Rose received apple cider in a tin cup and declared it better. That evening, Gideon stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the new frame against the late sky. Pale wood, square and solid, smelling of sawdust and pine sap. Larger than the old one. Silas's proper loft. The foundation laid flat and true. He thought about what it meant to rebuild something on the same ground where the original had stood. He'd wondered, when they cleared the ruin in March, whether it would feel like erasure, whether putting something new in the place of something lost would feel like denial. It didn't. It felt like what it was. A man who'd had something taken from him, deciding that the taking was not the final word. May came to stand beside him. She had flour on her sleeve from something she'd been doing in the kitchen, and she didn't seem to know it was there, which meant he would tell her later and she would look at it with the mild irritation she reserved for things that were her own fault. "Silas wants to paint it," she said. "I know. He's wanted to paint a barn for 20 years. "What color?" "Red," he said. "He'll say red." He did say red. "I told him you'd agree." She glanced at him. "You're going to agree, aren't you?" "It's his barn as much as mine at this point," Gideon said. She looked at the frame for a moment. "It's good," she said. She didn't mean the barn exactly, or not only the barn. "Yes," he said. Here is what he understood. Standing in the evening light in May, with a new barn going up, and a woman beside him who'd walked through a blizzard with a ledger and 2 children and rebuilt something out of all of it, that the things worth having are rarely the things you set out for. You set out for safety, for stability, for the comfortable continuity of a life that matches the one you planned. And then a storm drops out of the mountains early, and a woman knocks on your barn door, and everything rearranges itself around a different center. And the question is not whether the new arrangement was what you wanted. It wasn't, because you couldn't have known to want it, but whether you're brave enough to let it be what it is. He hadn't been brave, particularly. He'd been practical and occasionally stubborn, and sometimes right for the wrong reasons. He'd made decisions slowly and then held them without apology, and that was the closest thing to courage he'd been able to manage. It had been enough. May had been braver. She'd carried something she couldn't put down through circumstances that would have broken easier people, and had not asked for credit for any of it, because she didn't think of it as bravery. She thought of it as the job, the thing that needed doing, and she did it the way her father had done things, and the way she'd taught Finn to do things, and the way, eventually, Rose would learn by watching both of them. Not dramatic heroism, just the daily insistence on being a person who does what they said they'd do. There's a version of this story where Voss doesn't exist, where May's father lives, where she arrives in Colorado to marry a decent man and builds a simple life. She'd have been good at it. She'd have been a capable partner to someone who didn't deserve her, probably, and the ledger would have stayed hidden, and the fraud would have continued, and 9 families would still be scattered, and Obert Pickens would still be starting over in Nevada territory with nothing. This version is harder. More loss in it, more wreckage, more cost. The barn burned. Silas's side still aches in cold weather. Cord has a scar on his arm he'll carry the rest of his life. Justice was partial and slow, and will never be enough for people who lost years. May will write statements for families she'll never meet, and the process will be exhausting and incomplete, and she'll do it anyway. But Blue Mesa stands. The title is clear. The record is accurate. And on a Saturday evening in May, there is a 13-year-old boy at a kitchen table learning to balance accounts from the woman who learned from her father, and a 4-year-old girl telling a gray horse named Albert what she observed today, and a man with ink on his sleeve from helping hold the new wall frame at noon, still standing in a yard in the last of the daylight. Not exactly happy in any simple sense, but present, which is different and maybe more. Belonging isn't a thing you find. That was the truth of it, the thing May had understood and Gideon had been relearning since October. It isn't waiting somewhere for you to arrive. It's built, incrementally, out of the accumulation of chosen presence, out of showing up in someone's barn during a blizzard and staying when you could have gone, out of saddling a horse in the dark for a man who needs to ride to Denver, out of answering a boy's questions about accounting columns because he asked, and you know the answers, out of standing on a hillside with your hat in your hands and then coming back down. You do this long enough, in one place, with the same people, and one day you look up and the place is yours in a way no deed, nod, or title can fully capture, and the people are your people, in a way no certificate records. The barn would be painted red. Silas would do it himself, on a Saturday in June, on a ladder too high for a 61-year-old man with a healing side, and May would tell him so, and he would listen politely and continue. Finn would hold the ladder. Rose would observe and issue technical guidance from below. Gideon would watch from the yard and think that his foreman had been right about the loft, and probably about the paint too, and that there were worse things than being occasionally wrong when the person who's right is someone you trust. The valley went quiet as the light went. The new frame stood against the darkening sky, pale and straight and unfinished in the way that all good things are unfinished, not broken, just ongoing, waiting for the next day's work. May went inside. Gideon stood a moment longer the way he always stood, and then he followed.